I should have known something was wrong when my mother smiled at me. It was my wedding day, the day I'd marry Ethan Rhodes, a $5 billion tech CEO. The Connecticut estate glittered with crystal and champagne. 200 guests, cameras everywhere. I was finally going to have the perfect life my parents always denied me. Then I saw it. In the bridal suite, my mother brought me champagne for a private toast. Her hand moved so fast I almost missed it, a clear liquid dropping from a small vial into my glass. Our eyes met in the mirror. She smiled wider. "Drink up, darling." My heart stopped. My own mother. My own wedding day. I did something I can't explain, some survival instinct I didn't know I had. When my sister Lily walked in, I switched our glasses. Just a quick swap while adjusting my veil. Lily drank it. Minutes later, during the ceremony, she collapsed in front of 200 people, convulsing, choking. The champagne glass shattered on marble. My mother's scream cut through the chaos. Celeste poisoned her. She gave Lily that drink. The cameras captured everything. My wedding became a crime scene. My fiancé walked away. The world called me a monster. But here's what they didn't know, that poison was meant for me. My parents, my fiancé, they'd planned my destruction together. And when I finally discovered why, I realized I had two choices. Let them bury me or bury them first. I chose war. This is the story of how I destroyed everyone who tried to destroy me and became the villain they should have feared from the beginning. My name is Celeste Morgan. I'm 35 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was known primarily as one of New York's most innovative interior architects. I built my firm from nothing, won awards my parents barely acknowledged, and spent my entire life trying to earn love that was never freely given. Today was supposed to change everything. Today I was marrying Ethan Rhodes, and finally, I would have the validation, the belonging, the unconditional love I'd craved since childhood. I stood in the center of the Connecticut estate's grand ballroom, watching the final preparations transform the space into something that belonged in a magazine spread. Crystal chandeliers, each one worth more than my first year's salary, cast prismatic light across hundreds of white roses and gold accents that I'd personally selected. Through the tall windows, I could see media vans lining the circular driveway like eager predators. This wasn't just a wedding. This was the society event of the year. Celeste Morgan, self-made architect, marrying Ethan Rhodes, tech CEO with a net worth that made financial journalists stutter when they tried to quantify it. $5 billion. That's what they said he was worth. But to me, he was supposed to be worth something more precious, genuine affection. I touched the diamond necklace at my throat. My mother's necklace loaned to me for the day with instructions on how to wear it properly. Even her jewelry came with conditions. The stones felt cold against my skin, but I told myself it was a good omen, a bridge between my past and my future. This day marked my perfect new beginning, or so I desperately wanted to believe. I'd worked my entire life to reach this moment, climbing every impossible ladder, exceeding every expectation, proving myself worthy of the love that should have been my birthright. The memory hit me suddenly, pulling me back 3 months to the night that was supposed to be my greatest triumph. My design firm had just won the Architectural Digest Innovator of the Year award. The ceremony was held at the Plaza Hotel, and I wore a dress I'd saved 6 months to afford. When they called my name, I walked to that stage feeling like I was finally enough, finally worthy, finally seen. My parents attended, of course. Robert and Vivian Morgan never missed an opportunity to be photographed at a prestigious event. They sat in the third row, perfectly coordinated in their evening wear, and when I looked out at the audience during my acceptance speech, I saw my mother's smile. Tight, controlled. The smile of someone performing an emotion rather than feeling it. My father's response was worse, a single calculating nod, as if I'd completed a required task, rather than achieved something extraordinary. Afterward, at the reception, my mother air-kissed my cheek and said, "Well, darling, you've finally made the family proud." Finally. As if my previous decade of work had been some kind of embarrassing rehearsal. That night, I'd gone home to my apartment and cried into expensive wine, wondering why excellence was never enough for them. Why I was never enough. Every achievement in my life had been met with that same hollow acknowledgement, as if I was checking boxes on someone else's list rather than building my own dreams. I'd always felt like I was performing in a play where everyone else knew their lines except me. Then Ethan had proposed 2 weeks after that award ceremony, and something in me shifted. He'd taken me to dinner at Le Bernardin, told me I was brilliant and beautiful, and exactly what he'd been searching for. When he opened the ring box, I didn't see a 4-carat diamond. I saw escape. I saw a man who chose me not because I'd earned it through relentless achievement, but simply because he wanted me. For once in my life, I wasn't competing for love. It was being offered freely, or so I believed. The wedding planner's voice cut through my reverie. "Ms. Morgan, your parents have arrived." I turned to see them entering the ballroom, and my breath caught despite myself. They were magnificent. There was no other word for it. Robert Morgan. 62 moved through space like he owned it, which technically he did. His commercial real estate empire had made him a Connecticut legend, though the word legend could be interpreted in several ways depending on who you asked. He wore his tuxedo-like armor every line perfect, his silver hair swept back from a face that revealed nothing. My mother Vivian was equally formidable at 58. She'd been a successful attorney before marriage, though she rarely spoke of that life anymore. Now she was Mrs. Robert Morgan, and she wore that title with the same precision she applied to everything else. Her champagne-colored gown probably cost more than some people's cars, and her posture was so perfect it looked painful. They moved through the ballroom greeting guests with practiced charm, smiling and laughing at exactly the right moments. To anyone watching, they were the ideal parents of the bride, proud, elegant, invested. But I'd learned to read the micro-expressions beneath my mother's makeup. I watched her eyes as she surveyed the room, scanning every detail like a general inspecting troops. When she spotted a centerpiece that had been moved slightly off-center, she approached the nearest staff member. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw the way the young woman's face went pale, the way she immediately rushed to fix the arrangement. My mother's voice might have been pleasant, but her edge was sharp enough to draw blood. My father's power was different, quieter, but somehow more absolute. He stood near the windows, talking to Ethan's business partners, and I watched how they leaned in when he spoke, how they laughed too enthusiastically at his mild observations. People didn't just respect Robert Morgan, they feared him. I'd grown up watching that dynamic, never quite understanding how he commanded such deference without raising his voice or making overt threats. His silence was its own form of violence. Then I saw my sister, and something in my chest tightened. Lily, 29, moved through the ballroom like she was floating. Her pink bridesmaid dress, chosen by our mother, of course made her look like a princess from some fairy tale. She was laughing with a group of cousins, her face bright and open in a way mine had never been. I watched our parents' faces transform when they looked at her. My mother's tight smile became genuine. My father's calculating expression softened into something approaching tenderness. That was the difference between us, distilled into a single moment. Lily received their warmth effortlessly like sunlight, while I had spent 35 years standing in their shadow begging for scraps. I loved my sister, I did, but sometimes that love felt complicated by the weight of comparison, by the exhausting question of why she was lovable, and I was merely tolerated. I forced myself to smile as they approached me. Family photographs, the wedding planner reminded us. We needed to capture this moment for posterity. My father's hand on my shoulder felt heavy as a stone. My mother adjusted my veil with fingers that managed to be both gentle and controlling. Lily hugged me, her perfume sickeningly sweet, and whispered, "You look beautiful, sis." But when I looked into her eyes, I saw something I couldn't quite name, something that made my skin prickle with unease. The photographer positioned us near the windows where the light was best. "Perfect family," he said cheerfully, and we all smiled on command. I stood between my parents, Lily slightly in front, and as the camera clicked, I caught our reflection in one of the ballroom's gilded mirrors. We looked perfect, elegant, successful, happy. We looked like strangers wearing familiar faces, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was staring at people I'd never really known at all. Standing there watching my family pose and smile, I felt the weight of 35 years of performance pressing down on my shoulders. The memories I'd spent decades trying to bury surfaced with brutal clarity, each one a small cut that had never quite healed. I was 7 years old when I brought home my first perfect report card. Straight A's across every subject plus a handwritten note from my teacher praising my exceptional intellect and work ethic. I'd run through the front door of our Westport mansion, breathless with pride, clutching that paper like it was made of gold. My mother was in her study reviewing legal briefs. I thrust the report card toward her, waiting for the praise I was certain would finally come. She glanced at it for perhaps 3 seconds, her expression unchanged, and said, "That's expected, Celeste. You're a Morgan. Excellence is your baseline, not an achievement." Then she returned to her work, dismissing me with her silence. 3 days later, Lily, barely 3 years old, drew something that vaguely resembled a flower. Crooked stem, lopsided petals, colors that bled outside every line. My mother gasped with delight, scooped Lily up, and spent the next hour calling relatives to share the news of her younger daughter's remarkable artistic talent. By that evening, the drawing was professionally framed and hanging in the formal living room where important guests would see it. My report card went into a filing cabinet in the basement, along with all the others that would follow. The pattern repeated itself so many times, I eventually stopped counting. My piano recital at age 10, where I played a flawless Chopin nocturne after 6 months of daily practice, my parents sat in the audience with polite, frozen smiles, clapping exactly twice when I finished. Lily's kindergarten concert 2 weeks later, where she forgot half the words to "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" and sang the rest completely off-key. My mother stood up and cheered, filming every second, tears of joy streaming down her face. My father, who never showed emotion for anything I did, actually laughed with genuine warmth. I learned quickly that in the Morgan family my successes were obligations, while Lily's mere existence was cause for celebration. My mother's voice became the soundtrack of my childhood. "You don't get praised for breathing, Celeste. Weakness is unforgivable. You're the eldest, you're supposed to be stronger, smarter, better. Why do you need constant validation? Grow up." Every achievement I worked for became invisible the moment I accomplished it. Every tiny flaw or failure was magnified, dissected, held up as evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. I learned that love wasn't something freely given. It was something you earned through perfection. But perfection earned nothing except higher expectations and deeper disappointment when you inevitably fell short. Lily was always everything. I was never enough. The wedding planner needed me to check something in the estate's east wing, and I found myself walking through the portrait gallery where Morgan family history hung in gilded frames. I'd avoided this hallway for years, but today I paused in front of a photograph I'd almost forgotten existed. It showed me as a toddler, maybe 2 years old, standing alone in the estate's garden. I wore a white dress with pink ribbons, and I was looking off to the side at something outside the frame. But what struck me now as an adult was the composition. There was an oddly empty space beside me, as if the photographer had framed the shot for 2 children, but captured only one. I remembered asking my mother about that photograph when I was perhaps 8 or 9. Who was supposed to be there? I'd asked, pointing to that strange empty space. My mother's face had drained of all color. Her hand had trembled as she pulled the photograph album away from me. "No one?" She'd whispered, her voice strange and hollow. "You're imagining things. Don't ask about this again." The fear in her eyes had terrified me enough that I never did. Later that same year, I'd been exploring my childhood bedroom during a family visit to the estate, and I found a small music box tucked in the back of a forgotten drawer. It was porcelain hand-painted with delicate roses, the kind of precious object that seemed out of place in storage. When I opened it, tinny music played a lullaby I half remembered from early childhood. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a tarnished silver bracelet. I lifted it carefully, turning it toward the light to read the engraving C and C, C and C. My name started with C. But who was the other C I'd taken the music box downstairs to show my mother innocent and curious? The moment she saw what I was holding, her face transformed into something I'd never seen before. Raw panic mixed with fury. She'd snatched the music box from my hand so violently that the bracelet went flying across the room. "That's not yours," she'd hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Don't you ever touch things that don't belong to you. Do you understand me?" I'd nodded, terrified, and she'd carried the music box away. I never saw it again. But it was my father's power that truly shaped our family's dysfunction, a force so subtle and pervasive that I didn't fully understand it until adulthood. Robert Morgan built his commercial real estate empire through calculated ruthlessness, and he applied the same principles to his household. At the dinner table, his silence was more terrifying than any words my mother could speak. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. One disappointed look from him could destroy your entire sense of self-worth. A slight tightening around his eyes meant you'd failed some test you hadn't known you were taking. I remember watching my mother transform in his presence, this brilliant attorney who'd once argued cases before state supreme courts. She would shrink, become smaller and more compliant, her voice losing its edge, her opinions shifting to match his before he even voiced them. Vivian Morgan had been someone before she married my father. After marriage, she gradually disappeared into the title Mrs. Robert Morgan, and I watched it happen year by year, like witnessing a slow-motion drowning. My father controlled everything through money. Trust funds came with conditions. Gifts had strings attached that wouldn't reveal themselves until you were thoroughly entangled. Opportunities he offered were traps designed to increase your dependence on him. Every kindness was calculated, every generosity and investment he expected to collect on with interest. I realized as an adult that even my mother was a prisoner in the gilded cage he'd built, and her cruelty toward me and Lily was simply passing down the pain she herself endured. Hurt people, and the Morgan family had perfected the cycle across generations. The Morgan family didn't love. It consumed. It took promising individuals and ground them down into component parts that served the family machine. And I was beginning to understand that I'd never escaped at all. I'd just been on a longer leash than I realized. I didn't realize then that silence was my father's favorite weapon, and he'd been sharpening it my entire life. The memory of that silence, that weaponized quiet my father wielded so expertly, brought me back to the dinner 2 months ago, when everything should have felt celebratory, but instead felt like a negotiation I hadn't agreed to participate in. It was a private dinner at the Morgan estate, ostensibly to finalize wedding details. But the moment I walked into the formal dining room and saw the lawyers flanking both sides of the table, I knew something else was happening. Ethan's legal team sat on one side of the imported Italian marble table, 3 men in identical gray suits with briefcases that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. My father's lawyers mirrored them on the opposite side, and the symmetry felt deliberate, like chess pieces being positioned before a match. My mother presided at one end of the table, playing hostess with her practiced grace, pouring wine and making small talk about the weather while legal documents lay stacked between the crystal and china. The conversation started innocuously enough, discussing standard prenuptial terms. But then my mother's voice cut through the pleasantries with surgical precision. "Of course we've been thinking," she said, her tone delicate as lace over steel, "that perhaps Celeste and Ethan should consider merging certain business assets. As a show of true commitment and partnership. Marriage is about unity after all, not maintaining walls between each other." She smiled at me, that tight smile I knew so well, the one that wasn't really a smile at all, but rather a command wrapped in maternal concern. Every muscle in my body tensed. My design firm was mine. I'd built it from absolutely nothing while my parents criticized every risk I took, every client I pursued, every hire I made. They'd called it a hobby for the first 3 years, then a boutique venture, when it started turning profit, and finally a surprising success when I won my first major award. It represented every ounce of independence I'd managed to carve out from under their controlling influence. The idea of merging it with Ethan's vast corporate holdings, of letting it disappear into the Rhodes empire like a drop of water in an ocean, made my throat close with panic. "No," I said firmly, looking directly at my mother. "My firm stays separate. This is a marriage, not a corporate merger. I want my personal business kept distinct from our marital arrangement." Ethan reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it in what I interpreted as support, though looking back now I wonder if it was actually a warning. My father's jaw tightened so imperceptibly that anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime reading his micro-expressions would have missed it entirely. He said nothing, which somehow felt more ominous than if he'd argued. The lawyers exchanged glances, made notes on their legal pads, and the conversation moved forward to other clauses and conditions. But I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Later that night, after the lawyers had left and Ethan had driven back to the city, I was walking past my father's study when I heard his voice on the phone. The door was slightly ajar, and I paused, instinct telling me to listen. "The company is the only asset that matters," he was saying, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Once she's married, we'll have leverage. Rhodes understands the arrangement. She'll come around when she realizes she doesn't have a choice." I'd stood there in the hallway, my heart hammering, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. At the time, I convinced myself it was just typical Robert Morgan paranoia about keeping family wealth consolidated. He'd always been obsessive about control, about maintaining the Morgan empire through whatever means necessary. I dismissed it as his usual manipulative tendencies, not realizing that I wasn't the daughter in that equation. I was the asset being discussed. Ethan had seemed so perfect during our courtship, attentive, successful, understanding in ways my family never was. He'd listened to me talk about design philosophy for hours, or at least I thought he was listening. But lately, subtle changes had begun appearing like hairline cracks in expensive porcelain. During intimate dinners at exclusive restaurants, he'd check his phone constantly, his attention drifting to emails and messages even when I was mid-sentence. When I discussed my design projects with genuine excitement, his eyes would glaze over with barely concealed boredom. He'd interrupt my stories to pivot the conversation toward his acquisition deals, his latest tech innovations, his board meetings, as if my work was merely filler conversation until we could return to topics that actually mattered. 3 weeks before the wedding, I'd mentioned wanting to delay the ceremony by 2 months to finish a major client project, a luxury hotel renovation that represented the biggest commission of my career. His face had darkened in a way I'd never seen before, a flash of something cold and calculating that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "Everything's already arranged, Celeste," he'd said, his voice carrying an edge that made my stomach drop. "You're not backing out now." The phrasing struck me as odd even then. Backing out. As if marriage was a business contract he couldn't afford to lose rather than a lifelong commitment between two people who loved each other. He'd softened immediately after apologizing for the pressure, promising to protect me from my family's demands. But I'd noticed that he spent increasing amounts of time in private conversations with my father, their heads bent together at family dinners, speaking in low voices that stopped whenever I approached. The memory that haunted me most, though, was from 12 months earlier, before Ethan was even in the picture. Lily had shown up at my apartment at 2 a.m, makeup streaked with tears, trembling so violently I thought she might shatter. She'd collapsed on my couch and confessed through broken sobs that she was pregnant. The father was Marcus Hendrick, a married state senator and one of my father's longtime political allies. "Please don't tell Mom and Dad," she'd begged, gripping my hands with desperate strength. "Please, Celeste. They can't know. They'll destroy me." I'd promised to keep her secret, held her while she cried herself into exhausted sleep on my couch. But within 3 days, somehow impossibly, our parents knew everything. I never told them. Lily swore she didn't. Yet my mother appeared at my apartment with the story already fully formed in her mind, every detail correct, and informed me coldly that Lily was being sent to a wellness retreat in Switzerland to handle the situation discreetly. When Lily returned 3 months later, she was a ghost of herself, thin and hollow-eyed, speaking in monosyllables, flinching whenever our parents entered a room. I'd tried to comfort her to reach the sister I'd grown up with, but she'd pulled away from my embrace, her eyes haunted and distant. "You don't understand what they're capable of," she'd whispered. "You think you know, but you don't." At the time, I'd dismissed it as Lily being dramatic traumatized by the abortion and the forced isolation. I hadn't understood that she was trying to warn me. In that moment, standing in the ballroom, surrounded by flowers and champagne and the trappings of my perfect wedding day, balanced between my father's cold calculation and Ethan's warm promises, I realized with sick clarity that everyone I loved wanted something from me. The realization that everyone wanted something from me should have made me more cautious about Lily. But sisterhood is a complicated thing woven from equal parts love and resentment, loyalty and competition. When she'd shown up at my apartment 6 weeks before the wedding, arms full of champagne and bridal magazines playing the role of perfect maid of honor, I'd wanted so desperately to believe in the performance that I ignored every warning sign screaming beneath the surface. She'd sprawled across my couch like she owned it, flipping through pages of bridesmaid dresses with seemingly genuine enthusiasm. "What about this one?" she'd ask, pointing to some flowing confection in blush pink. "It would photograph beautifully, and you know Mom will have opinions, so we might as well preempt her." She laughed at the chaos of wedding planning, gave thoughtful advice about handling our mother's increasingly demanding phone calls, and helped me address invitation envelopes while we drank expensive Prosecco and pretended we were normal sisters doing normal sister things. To any outsider watching through my apartment windows, we would have looked close connected, the kind of siblings who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But I'd learned to read micro-expressions from years of surviving the Morgan family dinner table, and I caught things Lily probably didn't realize she was revealing. When the conversation turned to Ethan's wealth, to the prenuptial negotiations, and the properties we'd be splitting our time between, I saw the flash of envy cross her face before she schooled it back into supportive excitement. When my former colleague stopped by to congratulate me and spent 10 minutes praising my latest design project, Lily's smile became tight and fixed, her fingers gripping her champagne flute with enough force that I worried the stem might snap. Her compliments always seemed to carry barbs hidden inside them, thorns wrapped in silk. "You're so lucky everything works out for you," she said sweetly one afternoon, but her eyes told a completely different story. "Funny how the older sister always gets the prize." The words sounded playful, teasing the kind of thing sisters say to each other all the time. But they hung in the air between us like poison, and I found myself unable to respond, unsure whether I was supposed to laugh or defend myself or pretend I hadn't heard the venom underneath. The memory those words triggered was one I'd tried for years to bury, but it surfaced with perfect clarity. I was 12 years old, Lily was 8, and we were playing near the estate's stone fountain on a summer afternoon that had started out peacefully enough. We'd been arguing over a doll, some expensive porcelain thing our grandmother had given us to share, and I'd insisted it was my turn because Lily had played with it all morning. The argument escalated the way childhood disputes do, voices rising, accusations flying, but we weren't touching each other. We were just shouting, standing several feet apart near the fountain's edge. Then suddenly, without warning, Lily fell. She went down hard, her knees striking the stone rim of the fountain, and started screaming like she'd been mortally wounded. Our mother came running from the house, still wearing her tennis whites, and Lily's sobs became words. "Celeste pushed me. She pushed me because I wouldn't give her the doll." I stood there in shock, trying to process what was happening, trying to find words to explain that we'd only been arguing, that I'd never touched her, that she'd fallen on her own. But before I could form a complete sentence, my mother's hand connected with my face in a slap that left my ears ringing and my cheek burning. "You jealous, cruel child," she hissed. Her face twisted with disgust. "Your own sister. You could have seriously hurt her." I was grounded for an entire month, locked in my room except for meals and school, forbidden from attending my best friend's birthday party that I'd been looking forward to for weeks. Years later, at a family Christmas party when Lily was 16 and drunk on champagne she'd stolen from the adult table, she'd cornered me in the upstairs hallway and admitted the truth with the casual cruelty only teenagers can manage. "I lied that day at the fountain," she'd said, swaying slightly, her words slurred but perfectly comprehensible. "I fell on purpose because Mom always believed me and never believed you. It was so easy. I'm sorry." But she was laughing when she said it, laughing like it was the funniest joke in the world. And she never apologized again after that night, never acknowledged the confession, acted like it had never happened at all. Standing in my apartment, watching her flip through bridal magazines, I wondered how many other lies she'd told. How many other times she'd weaponized our mother's favoritism to hurt me and escaped consequence. The dress fitting 3 weeks before the wedding was when her mask slipped even further. We were in the bridal salon's private suite, surrounded by mirrors and champagne and the rustling of silk, when Lily mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought, "You know Mom and Dad are having money troubles, right? Dad's latest development deal fell through spectacularly. They were counting on—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening slightly, as if she'd realized she'd said too much, then pivoted the conversation so smoothly I almost missed the transition. "Anyway, this dress makes you look like a princess. Ethan won't be able to take his eyes off you." Later that same week, I came home early from a client meeting to find Lily in my apartment study, standing at my desk with papers spread in front of her. She looked up when I entered, startled but recovering quickly with one of her practiced smiles. "Oh, I was just admiring your success," she said, gesturing vaguely at the documents. "You've built something really impressive, sis." But I noticed which paper she'd been examining when I interrupted her, the recent valuation report for my design firm that showed it was now worth $50 million. The number was circled in red ink, a mark I definitely hadn't made. That night when she left, Lily hugged me at the door, squeezing tight like she meant it, like we were actually close. Her perfume enveloped me, sickeningly sweet, the kind of floral scent that's so overpowering it seems designed to cover something rotten underneath. When she pulled back, still smiling, I looked into her eyes and saw a stranger wearing my sister's face. When she hugged me that night, her perfume smelled like secrets, and I was only just beginning to learn how many she'd buried. The secrets Lily buried should have warned me that my entire family was capable of deceptions. I couldn't begin to imagine, but I was too focused on my wedding, too desperate to believe that tomorrow would mark a genuine new beginning, to see the trap closing around me. The night before the ceremony, my mother hosted what she called an intimate family dinner at the estate, and the moment I walked into the formal dining room, I felt the atmosphere press against my skin like something physical and suffocating. Candlelight flickered across crystal stemware and silver that had been in the Morgan family for 3 generations. The table could seat 20, but tonight only 6 chairs were occupied. My parents at either end, Ethan and me on one side, Lily across from us with an empty chair beside her that seemed to represent all the things we weren't discussing. The elegance was undeniable, the kind of refined wealth that appears in magazines, but beneath it, I felt something darker, something that made my throat tight and my hands cold despite the warmth from the fireplace. My father sat at the head of the table in his customary position of authority, barely speaking as course after course appeared before us. He didn't need to speak. His silence shaped the conversation more effectively than words ever could, and everyone at the table unconsciously oriented themselves toward his approval. My mother controlled the actual dialogue with surgical precision, steering us through topics that seemed casual but were anything but. She reminded me with a light laugh that didn't reach her eyes about the importance of family loyalty, how Morgan women had always understood that individual desires sometimes needed to be sacrificed for the greater good of the family unit. She mentioned trust fund access, noting almost casually that certain distributions were contingent on maintaining family unity and business cooperation. She brought up how family businesses should ideally stay within the family, how dangerous it was to let outsiders gain too much influence over Morgan assets. Ethan sat beside me, his hand occasionally touching mine under the table in what should have been comforting gestures, but felt more like claims of ownership. He was attentive to my father in ways that made my stomach turn, agreeing with everything Robert said, laughing at observations that weren't remotely funny, nodding along to suggestions about how we should structure our married life. I felt like a doll at my own dinner, a beautifully dressed prop, while the real people discussed my future without actually addressing me directly. The champagne they'd poured for the occasion tasted bitter on my tongue, metallic and wrong, though I couldn't tell if that was the wine or my growing sense of dread. Halfway through the main course, I excused myself to use the restroom, grateful for any escape from that suffocating dining room. I walked down the familiar hallway toward the guest bathroom, but as I passed the library, I heard my mother's voice coming from behind the partially open door. Something in her tone stopped me cold. It was low and urgent, stripped of the performative warmth she'd been displaying at dinner, and I found myself frozen in the hallway, barely breathing, listening to words that would haunt me. Through the crack in the door, I could see my mother standing close to Lily, their heads bent together in conspiracy. "Plan B will work this time," Vivian was saying, her voice tight with controlled intensity. "Once it begins, there's no stopping it. She'll never see it coming. We've planned too carefully for any mistakes." Lily nodded, her face troubled but compliant, that same expression I'd seen on her face when she returned from Switzerland. My mother continued, and her next words made my blood run cold. "The doctor confirmed the dosage. It needs to look completely natural, nothing that would raise suspicion during a standard examination. Tomorrow, everything changes. By this time next week, we'll have control of everything that matters." I wanted to burst through that door, to demand explanations, to scream at them, to tell me what they were planning, but fear paralyzed me completely. My legs wouldn't move, my voice wouldn't work. I stood in that hallway, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs, while my mother and sister discussed something that clearly involved me, something that involved doctors and dosages and things looking natural. What were they planning? What was Plan B, and what had Plan A been? I forced myself to move to return to the dining room before they realized I'd overheard. When I sat back down, my hands were shaking so badly I had to hide them in my lap. Minutes later, both my mother and Lily returned, their faces composed and pleasant, any trace of that urgent conversation completely erased. They smiled at me warmly, and when dessert was served, my mother raised her glass of champagne in a toast. "To tomorrow," she said, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that felt like a threat. "To new beginnings and family unity." Everyone raised their glasses. Ethan squeezed my hand. The crystal chimed as we touched our glasses together, and that sound seemed to echo through my bones like a warning bell I didn't know how to interpret. Later that evening, after dinner had ended, but before guests began leaving, I realized I'd left my phone in the drawing room where we'd gathered for pre-dinner cocktails. I went to retrieve it, my mind still spinning with fragments of the conversation I'd overheard, trying to piece together what it could possibly mean. The drawing room was empty now, elegant, and still in the lamplight, and I found my phone on the side table where I'd left it. That's when I saw my mother's Hermès purse sitting open on the adjacent table, its contents partially visible. My interior designer instincts had trained me to notice when things were out of place, when objects didn't belong in their environment, and what I saw inside that purse was certainly out of place. A small pharmaceutical bottle, the kind that would normally have a prescription label, except this one's label had been torn off completely. Through the amber plastic, I could see white powder inside, and every instinct I had screamed that this was wrong, that this object connected somehow to the conversation I'd overheard. Before I could reach for it, before I could examine it more closely, my mother's hand closed around my wrist with shocking strength. I hadn't heard her enter the room, hadn't sensed her presence behind me, and the sudden contact made me gasp. "Looking for something, darling?" Her voice was ice wrapped in silk, and when I turned to face her, her smile never wavered, never changed, but her eyes were absolutely cold. She snapped the purse shut with her free hand, the sound sharp as a slap in the quiet room. Nervous brides shouldn't snoop through other people's belongings. It's unbecoming. She released my wrist and walked away, leaving me standing there with my skin burning where she'd grabbed me, my heart racing, my mind screaming warnings I didn't yet know how to interpret. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that small bottle glowing in my mother's purse, and the cold calculation in her eyes when she caught me looking. I'd spent the sleepless night trying to convince myself I was paranoid, that the overheard conversation and the mysterious bottle were coincidences my anxious brain had twisted into conspiracy, but when morning sunlight streamed through the bridal suite's tall windows, I knew with sick certainty that something terrible was coming. The room looked like a florist's fever dream, overflowing with white roses, gardenias, and peonies arranged in crystal vases that caught the light and threw rainbow prisms across the walls. My custom Vera Wang gown hung near the window like a ghost bride waiting to possess me, its silk and lace so beautiful it hurt to look at directly. Hair and makeup artists moved through the suite with quiet efficiency, their hands gentle and practiced as they transformed me into the bride magazines would want to feature. My bridesmaids' college friends who didn't know the truth about my family laughed over mimosas and took selfies, their joy genuine and uncomplicated in ways I envied desperately. Everything was cinematically perfect, orchestrated down to the smallest detail, the kind of wedding that would be photographed for luxury lifestyle publications and used as inspiration by thousands of women planning their own ceremonies. Yet I felt completely detached from it all, watching myself in the mirror like I was observing an actress preparing for a role she hadn't auditioned for and didn't want. The woman in the reflection looked beautiful. Her skin glowed with professional makeup. Her hair was styled in soft waves that looked effortless, but had taken 90 minutes to achieve. Her eyes were bright and clear despite the sleepless night. She looked poised, successful, like someone who had everything she'd ever wanted. She looked nothing like the scared girl who'd spent her entire childhood craving scraps of maternal approval. Today, I told myself, forcing the thought into my frightened brain like a mantra, everything changes. Today, I marry Ethan and escape this family forever. Today, I become someone new. But then, my mother entered the bridal suite, and every muscle in my body tensed with recognition of danger I couldn't yet name. She carried a silver tray, and on it sat a single crystal flute of champagne, the liquid golden and sparkling in the morning light. "For my daughter," she announced to the room, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal warmth she used when performing for audiences. "A private toast before the ceremony, a Morgan family tradition." She smiled at the hairstylist, the makeup artists, the bridesmaids. And somehow that smile was a dismissal more effective than words could have been. They gathered their things, murmuring congratulations, and filed out of the suite. Even Lily, who'd been adjusting her bridesmaid dress in the corner, moved toward the door, though she glanced back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Alone now, my mother and I faced each other in the mirror like adversaries preparing for battle. She set the tray on the vanity beside my perfume bottles and jewelry boxes, the champagne flute catching light and throwing golden reflections across the marble surface. "You've made me so proud, Celeste," she said, and if I hadn't known better, I might have believed the emotion in her voice was genuine. "This wedding, this man, this life you're building, it's everything I wanted for you. Everything I dreamed of when you were born." Her hand reached toward her small clutch purse, the same Hermes bag I'd seen last night, and I watched in the mirror with my heart climbing into my throat. Her movements were swift and practiced the motion of someone who'd rehearsed this exact sequence. The small vial appeared in her hand for barely a second before she tipped it over the champagne flute. I saw the clear liquid drop into the golden bubbles, saw it disappear without leaving any visible trace. Our eyes met in the mirror at that exact moment, and time seemed to suspend itself. My mother's face remained perfectly composed, not a flicker of guilt or hesitation crossing her elegant features. She smiled at me, and in that smile I saw everything. The calculation, the years of planning, the cold determination of someone who'd decided long ago that I was an obstacle rather than a daughter. "Drink up, darling," she said, picking up the glass and extending it toward me. "It's nearly time. You don't want to be late for your own wedding." She watched me with the intensity of a scientist observing an experiment, waiting for me to take the glass to bring it to my lips to swallow whatever she'd put inside it. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities in the space between heartbeats. This was the dosage from the overheard conversation. This was Plan B. This was the thing that needed to look natural, the thing that would change everything by this time next week. My hand reached for the glass automatically, years of obedience overriding my terror. But some survival instinct I didn't know I possessed made me speak before I drank. "Let me get Lily first," I heard myself say, my voice surprisingly steady. "She should share this moment with us. Sisters should be together for important family traditions." My mother's jaw tightened so slightly that anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime reading her micro-expressions would have missed it entirely. "This is just for us, Celeste," she said, and now there was steel underneath the warmth. A mother-daughter moment. Lily will have her own toast later. But I was already moving toward the door, already calling my sister's name, my designer's brain calculating angles and possibilities. Lily entered, looking confused, her pink bridesmaid dress rustling as she crossed the threshold. "You wanted me?" she asked, glancing between our mother and me with an expression that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. What happened next occurred so quickly that later I would question whether I'd truly planned it or whether instinct had taken over completely. In the chaos of Lily entering, of adjusting my veil that had somehow come loose, of the photographer knocking on the door, asking for one more shot before the ceremony, I moved close to the vanity where the tray sat. My hands, trained through years of arranging objects with precision, switched the champagne flutes. The full one I'd been meant to drink traded places with an empty one that had been sitting on the tray for decoration. It was subtle, quick, executed with the kind of fluid grace that comes from a career spent manipulating space and objects. I caught my mother's eye for just a fraction of a second, and I saw uncertainty flicker across her face before she could mask it. "A toast," I said brightly, handing the full glass to Lily. "To sisters, to family, to everything that comes next." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too cheerful, too performative, but no one seemed to notice, except possibly my mother, whose eyes had gone very cold and very calculating. Lily accepted the glass with a confused smile, raised it in acknowledgement, and drank deeply while the photographer captured the moment. The champagne bubbles caught the light as they rose to the surface, golden and innocent and deadly. And as the room filled with laughter and camera flashes, I watched my sister drink and prayed I was wrong about everything. My prayer that I was wrong died the moment the ceremony began, because even as I walked down that aisle, even as 200 guests rose to their feet in rustling elegance, I knew something terrible was unfolding, and I had set it in motion. The grand hall had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, every surface gleaming with candlelight and crystal flowers cascading from every available surface in waves of white and cream. My father's arm beneath my hand was stiff and unyielding, more like a prison guard escorting an inmate than a father giving away his daughter, and I felt his fingers dig into my elbow with just enough pressure to remind me that I was still under his control. Ethan waited at the altar in his perfectly tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, looking every inch the billionaire groom that tabloids had been breathlessly covering for months. He was objectively handsome, composed everything a bride should want. But when he smiled at me as I approached, I noticed what I'd been too desperate to see before his smile didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes were calculating something, measuring something, and I realized with sick clarity that I was the commodity being evaluated. The officiant began speaking in those traditional phrases that have echoed through countless weddings, words about love and commitment and forever. And I heard my own voice responding on cue, steady and clear, promising things I no longer believed I could deliver. But even as I spoke my vows, even as I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching this performance, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder at Lily. She stood directly behind me in her pale pink silk bridesmaid dress, holding her bouquet of white roses, and something about her appearance made my stomach clench with dread. Her face looked flushed, almost fevered, with spots of unnatural color high on her cheekbones. She was swaying slightly, barely perceptibly, like a tree in wind only she could feel. I told myself it was emotion, Or perhaps she'd had too much champagne during the morning preparations, anything except the truth that was screaming in the back of my mind. The ceremony proceeded with flawless precision, each moment timed and choreographed. We exchanged rings, the platinum bands sliding onto our fingers with the finality of handcuffs clicking shut. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife, his voice resonant and pleased, and applause began to ripple through the assembled guests. Then Lily gasped. It wasn't a loud sound, barely audible over the applause, but I heard it with perfect clarity because I'd been waiting for it, dreading it, knowing it was coming. She stumbled forward, her hands reaching out desperately to clutch the massive flower arrangement beside the altar for balance. White roses cascaded across the marble floor like snow petals scattering in every direction, and the beauty of that image would haunt me forever because of what came after. Her face had gone from flushed to stark white in the span of seconds, and I saw her lips tinged with blue like she'd been drowning. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but only wheezing sounds emerged from her throat. Horrible strangled noises that made every guest go silent. Her body convulsed once violently, as if electricity was coursing through her nervous system. Then again harder, and I watched her spine arch backward in a way that looked anatomically impossible. Then she crumpled, folding in on herself like a broken doll whose strings had been cut, and the sound of her body hitting marble echoed through the suddenly silent hall. The champagne flute she must have been carrying, the one she'd drunk from in the bridal suite just an hour before, fell from her hand and shattered against the floor. Crystal shards sprayed outward in a starburst pattern that caught the light and threw rainbows across the white marble even as my sister's body jerked and seized. Guests began screaming, the sound building from a few voices into a crescendo of panic. Ethan rushed forward, or I think he did. But my father was faster, moving with surprising speed for a man his age, catching Lily before her convulsing head could strike stone and crack open like an egg. My mother's scream cut through every other sound, high and piercing and perfectly modulated to carry across the entire hall. "Call 911, someone call 911, someone poisoned my daughter." And even through my shock, even through my horror at watching Lily's body seize and foam appear at the corners of her mouth, I noticed something strange about my mother's scream. It was too perfect, too precisely timed, and when I looked at her face I saw grief and rage. Yes, but underneath it something else. Something calculated, something performed. Paramedics appeared so quickly it seemed impossible, as if they'd been waiting just outside the hall, positioned and ready, and I watched them swarm around Lily's convulsing body with professional efficiency. They had equipment. A stretcher. Oxygen, things that should have taken time to gather but were somehow immediately available. The guests pressed back, giving them room, and I saw phones rising everywhere, dozens of them recording this moment from every angle, capturing my sister's medical crisis for immediate upload to social media. As they loaded Lily onto the stretcher, strapping her down because she was still seizing, still making those horrible choking sounds, my mother turned. She whirled on me with theatrical precision, and I saw the exact moment she decided to play the scene she'd been planning all along. Her face contorted into a mask of grief and maternal rage, and yet something in her eyes remained cold-controlled like an actress who hadn't fully inhabited her role. "You gave her that drink," she screamed, her voice carrying across the hall with perfect acoustics reaching every corner, making sure every recording phone could capture her words. "You insisted she toast with you in the bridal suite. You handed her that glass." Her finger pointed at me, accusatory and damning, and I felt 200 pairs of eyes swing toward me with the weight of judgment already rendered. Ethan took a step back from me, actually physically distancing himself, and when I turned to him, desperately seeking some kind of support or defense, his expression was completely unreadable. Not shocked, I realized. Not surprised. Just watching, measuring, calculating his next move. My father's hand remained on my mother's shoulder, steadying her performance, but his eyes locked onto mine with an expression I'd seen before. It was satisfaction. It was triumph. It was the look of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as designed. A guest's voice carried clearly in the momentary silence. She was always jealous of her sister. Everyone knew it. This was bound to happen eventually. The murmur of agreement that followed made my blood run cold. Security personnel I didn't recognize began moving toward me through the crowd, their radios crackling with coordination. I tried to speak, to explain, to defend myself, but my voice had completely failed. My throat was closed with terror and shock and the horrible realization of what I'd done. I'd switched the glasses thinking I was protecting myself, but I'd just poisoned my sister instead, and my entire family had been counting on exactly that. And then my mother screamed my name not in fear, but in accusation, like she'd been rehearsing that moment her entire life. My mother's accusation still echoed in my ears when I realized that 30 minutes after Lily collapsed, the story had already exploded across the entire internet. Someone thrust a phone in my face and I saw hashtags trending in real time: hashtag poisoned bride, #Aj Morgan wedding, tragedy, Aj Celeste, Morgan. The numbers climbed as I watched tens of thousands becoming hundreds of thousands, the algorithm feeding on scandal like it was designed for exactly this moment. Guest footage flooded social media from dozens of angles. Lily collapsing in perfect high definition, my mother's theatrical accusation captured with crystal-clear audio, and me standing motionless in my wedding gown, looking every inch the beautiful villain from a Gothic novel. News vans arrived before the police did, which should have struck me as impossible, but somehow wasn't surprising at all. Reporters with microphones and camera crews swarmed the estate's gates, shouting questions at fleeing guests who covered their faces and speedwalked to their cars. I watched through a window as the narrative formed in real time. Instant and unshakable jealous older sister poisons the golden child at her own wedding. A story so perfectly crafted for viral consumption that it might as well have been scripted. Nobody questioned how the media had arrived so quickly, as if they'd been tipped off hours in advance and positioned strategically to capture maximum footage. Within an hour, my entire life had been excavated and recontextualized into evidence of my guilt. Those interviews I'd given to design magazines where I'd mentioned my challenging family dynamics were recut and presented as proof of deep-seated resentment. My college therapist visits for anxiety, which I'd attended during a particularly stressful semester, were resurrected as evidence of a documented history of mental illness. One tabloid had already published a timeline of warning signs everyone missed, complete with photographs of me at family events where I looked serious or distracted, each image captioned with psychiatric speculation from people who'd never met me. The court of public opinion convicted me before the police even finished processing the scene, and I understood with devastating clarity that this was exactly what my family had engineered. Ethan found me in the chaos and pulled me into a side room away from the police, who were beginning to separate and interview guests, away from the cameras that were trying to capture every angle of the tragedy. I expected him to hold me, to protect me, to be the partner who'd promised to love me through everything. Instead, his first words were, "Jesus Christ. Celeste, what were you thinking?" His voice was cold and distant, the exact tone I'd heard him use on phone calls with startups that had failed to meet projections with employees he was about to terminate. "I didn't do anything." The words came out as a cry, desperate and plaintive. "The champagne was meant for me. I switched the glasses because I saw my mother put something in it. I saw her—" He cut me off before I could finish, his hand slicing through the air in a gesture of dismissal. "Do you hear yourself? You sound completely paranoid. You're claiming your own mother tried to poison you at your wedding." He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, pacing the small room like a caged animal looking for escape. "My lawyers are advising me to distance myself from this situation until it's resolved, for both our sakes. The optics are catastrophic." I stared at him, watching my husband of less than an hour transform into a corporate strategist managing a PR crisis. He wasn't asking for my understanding. He was informing me of a decision already made. "The wedding is postponed indefinitely. I'll release a statement expressing concern for Lily and requesting privacy. You should not contact me directly until your legal situation is clarified." He left before I could respond, and I stood alone in that room wearing my wedding dress. understanding that I'd just been abandoned by the man who'd promised me forever approximately 45 minutes ago. The police were everywhere now, photographing everything, taking statements, treating the grand hall like the crime scene it apparently was. I found myself walking out to the garden in a daze, my wedding gown collecting grass stains and dirt, until I collapsed on a stone bench near the fountain where Lily and I had played as children. That's where my father found me, and when he sat down beside me, I felt a flicker of desperate hope that maybe he would be different, that maybe one parent would believe me. He didn't speak for a long moment, just sat in that silence he'd always wielded as a weapon. Then so quietly I almost didn't hear, "You should have just signed over the company when we asked nicely. This wouldn't have been necessary." My blood turned to ice in my veins. "What?" He stood brushing invisible dust from his tuxedo, adjusting his cufflinks with the same meticulous care he applied to everything. "Family doesn't betray family, Celeste. You thought you could keep secrets, build your own empire separate from us. Everything flows from blood and name. You were always too stubborn to understand what loyalty actually means." He looked down at me with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. "This could have been simple. Instead, you've made it complicated. That's always been your problem." He walked away across the perfectly manicured lawn, leaving me sitting there in my ruined wedding dress, finally understanding that this hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a plan. Every piece carefully arranged, every contingency accounted for, every outcome engineered to end with me destroyed and my company transferred to their control. I wanted to scream, to fight, to explain to someone, anyone, what had really happened, but my voice drowned under the weight of their perfectly orchestrated lies. The weight of their orchestrated lies crushed me so completely that by evening I had become infamous in ways I couldn't have imagined that morning when I'd put on my wedding dress. I sat alone in my apartment, still wearing that dress because I couldn't summon the energy to remove it, and watched my life disintegrate across every screen. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Billionaire bride accused of poisoning sister in wedding day attack." The New York Times, which I'd once dreamed would feature my architectural work instead, ran lengthy analysis pieces about sibling rivalry in wealthy families, complete with quotes from psychologists who'd never met me speculating about my obvious pathological jealousy. My official engagement portrait, the one where I'd been professionally styled to look powerful and composed for the society pages, had become the definitive image of sisterly betrayal. That photograph was everywhere, now repurposed and recontextualized. My slight smile reinterpreted as cold calculation. My direct gaze at the camera transformed into evidence of narcissistic personality disorder. I watched that image multiply across the internet like a virus. Each repost adding new commentary, new judgment, new hatred. My phone vibrated constantly with notifications I couldn't bring myself to silence. Former clients, people whose homes and offices I'd designed with meticulous care, released carefully worded statements about pausing our professional collaborations pending resolution of these serious allegations. The Architectural Digest, which had celebrated my Innovator Award just 3 months ago, quietly removed every mention of my name from their website as if I'd never existed. My assistant, who I'd mentored for 2 years, quit via text message. "I can't be associated with this. Please don't contact me again." The hate mail flooding my email was beyond anything I could have prepared for. Strangers wished for my arrest, my death, my public humiliation in terms so graphic and violent that I had to stop reading after the first dozen. Twitter had become a cesspool of people who'd never met me calling for justice, for punishment, for blood. Someone had created a Change.org petition titled "Justice for Lily Morgan," demanding my immediate arrest and prosecution. I watched the signature count climb in real time: 10,000, 20,000, 40,000. It reached 50,000 signatures in 6 hours. I had become America's most hated woman overnight, and the speed of my fall was so complete, so total, that I understood this wasn't organic outrage. This was manufactured, orchestrated, designed to be inescapable. The next morning, Ethan held a press conference outside his Tribeca penthouse. I watched it live-streamed on my laptop, still sitting on my couch in my ruined wedding dress, and felt whatever remained of my heart turn to stone. He stood before a dozen cameras looking appropriately devastated, his expression perfectly calibrated by whatever crisis PR team his family had hired. "I am shocked and devastated by yesterday's events," he read from a prepared statement, his voice heavy with practiced emotion. "My heart goes out to Lily Morgan and the entire Morgan family during this incredibly difficult time. Until we have clarity about what transpired, I believe it's best for all parties if Celeste and I take space to reevaluate our relationship. I ask for privacy as we navigate this tragedy." He took no questions, simply turned and walked back into his building, leaving the reporters to interpret his careful words. The message was clear without being legally actionable. He was abandoning me completely, cutting all ties, protecting himself and his fortune from the contamination of my scandal. Within hours, his family's lawyers filed a motion to nullify our prenuptial agreement, citing the clause about felony accusations that I now understood had been inserted specifically for this purpose. They wanted their $50 million back, the money they would have owed me if Ethan had simply ended the engagement. I'd served my purpose in their plan, and now they were ensuring I'd gain nothing from the wreckage. But it was my parents' performance that truly destroyed whatever small hope I'd been clinging to. They held a press conference outside the hospital where Lily was being treated, and I watched them transform into grieving parents with such convincing authenticity that for a moment I almost believed them myself. My mother wore elegant black, her face pale and drawn, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief that the cameras captured in perfect detail. "Lily is our light, our joy," she said, her voice breaking at exactly the right moments. "To see her fighting for her life, to know that her own sister—" She couldn't finish, covering her face with her hands, and my father's arm came around her shoulders in a gesture of support that looked absolutely genuine. Robert took over, his voice solid and grave, projecting the gravitas of a man bearing unbearable truth. "We need to talk about mental illness in our family," he said, and I felt my stomach drop even before he continued. "We've tried to get Celeste help for years, but she refused treatment. She's always struggled with reality, with jealousy, with feelings of inadequacy that manifested in increasingly concerning behaviors." He reached into his jacket and produced papers, medical records that he held up for the cameras. I knew without seeing them closely that they were fabricated, but they looked official, legitimate, damning. "We have documentation," he continued, showing that Celeste was prescribed anti-anxiety medication for paranoid ideation, that she attended therapy for delusional thoughts about her family. We hoped that love would heal her, that marriage to a good man would give her the stability she needed. Instead, jealousy consumed her. He paused, letting that word hang in the air. Jealousy, the simplest, most believable motive. We failed her as parents, and now Lily is paying the price for our failure. My mother reached for his hand, and they stood together, united in their grief and their lies. The picture of devastated parents trying to make sense of their daughter's inexplicable violence. The performance was absolutely flawless, and I watched the comment sections of every news site fill with sympathy for them, with anger at me, with calls for justice that my parents had carefully orchestrated. They took everything that mattered: my name, my future, my voice, my ability to defend myself or tell my version of events, and the world believed them completely, totally, without question, because their lies were prettier, more compelling, more emotionally satisfying than my truth could ever be. My parents' prettier lies had won so completely that within days I ceased to exist as anything except the monster they'd created, and I watched myself disappear into that role with a kind of detached horror I couldn't fight. My phone died from the constant barrage of hate messages, the battery finally giving up under the weight of thousands of people wishing me dead, and I didn't charge it. What was the point? There was no one left who wanted to hear my voice. No one who would believe anything I said. The apartment building's doorman, who'd greeted me cheerfully every morning for 3 years, now watched me through the glass doors with obvious suspicion and barely concealed fear, his hand hovering near the phone as if I might attack at any moment. Former friends whose calls I'd always returned, whose children I'd sent birthday gifts to, whose homes I'd helped design, stopped trying to reach me entirely. My business partner, the woman I'd built my firm with from nothing, sent a legal notice through her attorney rather than speaking to me directly. The language was cold and final. Our partnership was being dissolved immediately, my name stripped from the company we'd named together because the brand had become too toxic to salvage. She was right, of course. No one would hire a designer accused of poisoning her own sister. The firm we'd spent a decade building was worthless as long as my name remained attached to it. I couldn't leave my apartment without being recognized and harassed. The first time I tried just to buy basic groceries because I'd run out of everything, someone recognized me in the store and started screaming, calling me murderer, psychopath, monster. Other shoppers pulled out their phones to record, and within minutes I was trending again with new footage of me looking disheveled and hunted in the produce section. I abandoned my cart and ran back to my apartment, and I didn't try to leave again. On the third night of my isolation, someone threw a brick through my living room window. The glass exploded inward, and I found myself screaming and covering my head with my arms surrounded by glittering shards that caught the streetlight like tiny accusations. Taped to the brick was a note written in red marker, "Murderer, you deserve what's coming." I called the police, but the officer who eventually showed up made it clear through his tone and his barely concealed contempt that public sentiment was against me, that I'd brought this on myself, that I should consider myself lucky it was only a brick. He took a report that I knew would go nowhere and left me to clean up the glass alone. I stopped eating because food tasted like ash, and my stomach rejected everything anyway. I stopped bathing because what was the point of cleanliness when everything felt contaminated? I stopped functioning in any meaningful way. The woman who'd climbed to professional success through sheer determination and relentless work ethic now couldn't summon the energy to get off her couch. I sat in the same spot for hours, sometimes days, staring at my wedding dress that still hung in its plastic garment bag on the back of my bedroom door, mocking me with its pristine whiteness, its expensive lace, its promise of happiness that had lasted less than an hour. On day 5, my lawyer called. He was one of maybe 3 people who hadn't completely abandoned me, though I suspected that had more to do with his retainer fee than any belief in my innocence. His voice was carefully neutral as he delivered the news Lily was stable, out of immediate danger, but claiming complete memory loss of the 24 hours before the wedding. Convenient, I thought with bitter clarity. So convenient that she couldn't be questioned about what she might have known about what our mother had told her about any conversations that might contradict the official narrative. The toxicology report had been sealed by court order, he continued. My parents had petitioned to protect Lily's privacy, but we both knew the real reason was narrative control. They didn't want me to know what substance had actually been used, didn't want me to have any information that might help me build a defense. Then came the words that made my blood run cold. The district attorney is moving forward with the investigation. Formal charges are expected within 2 weeks. He paused, and I heard him take a breath. Attempted murder, Celeste. If Lily had died, they'd be charging you with first-degree murder. You need to prepare yourself for arraignment. I have to be honest with you, the evidence isn't good. After he hung up, I sat in the dark of my apartment and felt something break inside me that had been holding on by threads. Not my spirit that was already destroyed. Something deeper. Some fundamental belief that truth mattered, that justice existed, that the world made sense if you just worked hard enough and played by the rules. At 2 a.m, operating on some instinct I didn't understand, I drove to the Morgan estate. Security had been removed, the gates standing open, and I realized my parents probably assumed I'd never dare to come back here to the scene of my destruction. The grand hall was dark and empty. All the wedding decorations removed, chairs stacked against the walls. The space returned to its usual cold elegance. But I wasn't there for elegance. I walked across the marble floor in the darkness, guided by memory and moonlight streaming through the tall windows, until I found what I was looking for: the champagne stain where Lily had fallen. Someone had tried to clean it, scrubbed at it with chemicals and effort, but a faint discolored mark remained on the pale stone. I knelt beside it, my knees hitting marble with a crack that echoed through the empty hall, and I placed my palm flat against that stain, against the cold stone that had witnessed my sister's collapse and my life's destruction. Something shifted inside me in that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. Grief transformed into ice-cold clarity. Despair crystallized into purpose. They had buried me alive, destroyed everything I'd built, taken my name and my future and my voice. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd forgotten to check if I was actually dead. That was the night Celeste Morgan died, and someone sharper, colder, unbreakable was born from her ashes. The person born from those ashes was harder than the old Celeste had ever been, and she understood that survival required more than just determination. It required information allies and a willingness to fight with the same ruthless tactics her family had used against her. 3 weeks after the wedding, a package arrived at my apartment door with no return address, no postage marks, nothing to indicate where it had come from or who had sent it. Just a plain brown box sitting in my hallway when I opened the door to retrieve yet another stack of hate mail. Inside the box were 2 items, a flash drive and a burner phone. Before I could even process what I was looking at, the phone rang, the sound so sudden and loud in my silent apartment that I nearly dropped it. I answered with shaking hands, and a voice came through, digitally distorted, unrecognizable, speaking with the mechanical quality of someone using voice-altering software. "You're looking for the wrong thing," the voice said without preamble. "They didn't want you dead. They wanted you discredited. Check the drive." Then the line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone and trying to understand what had just happened. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The files that appeared weren't the official toxicology reports that had been sealed by court order. These were preliminary lab results, the kind that get generated in the first hours after a patient arrives at the hospital before lawyers and judges get involved. I scanned through the technical language and medical jargon until I found what mattered. The substance detected in Lily's bloodstream was benzodiazepine, a powerful sedative used to treat anxiety and panic disorders. The dosage was high, the report noted, but notably non-lethal. Then came the observations that made my breath catch. Effects at this concentration include severe confusion, loss of motor control, slurred speech, erratic behavior symptoms consistent with acute psychological breakdown, non-fatal dosage. Query: why this specific drug and this specific amount? My mind started racing, connecting fragments that had seemed random before, but now formed a horrifying pattern. Benzodiazepine wouldn't kill someone, it would humiliate them. I closed my eyes and imagined the plan as it was supposed to unfold. I drink the champagne in the bridal suite. Feel fine initially, because the drug takes time to reach peak concentration. I walk down the aisle on my father's arm, everything appearing normal. The ceremony begins. Then right around the time we're exchanging vows in front of 200 guests and countless cameras, the drug hits my system fully. I start slurring my words. I stumble. Maybe I become paranoid. Start making wild accusations that sound like delusions. Perhaps I even become aggressive or start screaming. Every phone in that hall would be recording. Every guest would be witnessing my complete psychological breakdown at my own wedding. Ethan would be mortified, his perfect wedding ruined by his unstable bride. My parents would rush to my side, faces etched with concern they'd practiced in mirrors, and they'd sorrowfully admit to the assembled crowd and the inevitable media that I'd been struggling with mental health issues for years, that they'd tried to get me help, but I'd refused treatment. Within hours, the footage would be everywhere, and within days, they'd have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. No one would question it. Everyone had just witnessed my breakdown with their own eyes. And here's where the plan became truly diabolical. Under Connecticut law, my father could petition for temporary guardianship over an incapacitated adult family member, especially one who'd demonstrated she was a danger to herself or others. With me locked in a psychiatric facility declared incompetent, Robert Morgan would gain legal control over my assets, my company, my entire financial life. The realization hit me like physical force. I pulled out my own financial records documents I'd kept meticulously organized in my home office and started connecting dots I'd been too naive to see before. My design firm, recently valued at $50 million, held commercial contracts for 3 major developments in Connecticut and New York. When I looked closer at those projects, I saw what I'd missed. They were all connected to properties my father's company either owned or had significant stakes in. If my firm dissolved with me as an incompetent guardian, those contracts would need to be reassigned. Robert, as my legal guardian, could assign them to whomever he chose, probably his own failing companies, or sell them to cover his mounting debts. I dug deeper into files I'd barely glanced at before board meeting minutes from Morgan family corporate holdings that I'd attended but hadn't really paid attention to because they'd seemed like tedious business discussions. Now I read them with new eyes and saw the truth hidden in corporate language proposals to consolidate Morgan family holdings under unified management structure. Discussions about streamlining business operations under central family leadership, mentions of leveraging all available family assets to address current market challenges. They'd been planning to cannibalize my success for months, maybe years. The wedding wasn't the beginning of their plan. It was the execution, the perfect public stage where my destruction would be witnessed and believed by hundreds of people and broadcast to millions more. Every piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. My father's business was failing, bleeding money from failed development deals and market downturns. My company was the only liquid asset in the family that was actually worth something. When I'd refused to merge operations, refused to let them absorb what I'd built, they'd realized they needed another approach. They needed me, declared incompetent so they could take it without my consent. The poison was never meant to kill, it was meant to drive me insane in the most public way possible. They didn't want me dead. They wanted me silenced, controlled, and profitable, buried alive in an institution while they spent my life's work to save themselves. Understanding that they'd wanted me institutionalized rather than dead gave me something I hadn't had in weeks: direction, purpose, a way to fight back that didn't involve simply screaming denials into the void. I transformed my apartment into an investigation headquarters, becoming a detective of my own life in ways I'd never imagined I'd need to be. I cleared one entire wall of my living room and started building a timeline, pinning up photographs and documents and dates, connecting them with red string, like I'd seen in crime dramas, except this crime had been committed against me, and I was both victim and investigator. I started with my medical records, requesting copies from every doctor I'd ever seen, and that's when I discovered the first concrete proof of their long-term planning. Someone had requested my therapy files from college records from the counseling center I'd visited during a particularly stressful semester when I was 20 years old. The request form had my signature on it, but I knew immediately it wasn't mine. The loops were wrong. The pressure too consistent, the work of someone who'd practiced copying my handwriting but hadn't quite mastered the unconscious variations that make a signature authentic. The request had come from my mother's law firm, processed 8 months before my wedding, long before I'd had any reason to suspect my family was plotting against me. Those therapy records were innocuous, just standard college anxiety about grades and future career prospects, and the normal struggles of early adulthood, but in the right hands, they could be weaponized. I'd discussed family stress in those sessions, mentioned feeling like I could never meet my parents' expectations, admitted to anxiety about disappointing them. In context, it was normal. Out of context, selected and presented by skilled manipulators, it could sound like the early warning signs of serious mental illness. But it got worse. During one of my previous visits to the estate, before I'd had any reason to be suspicious, I'd used my mother's bathroom and had impulsively looked through the papers in her study, not snooping, just curious about her life in the way daughters sometimes are. I'd photographed some documents with my phone, not sure why at the time, just feeling like I should preserve something. Now I pulled up those photos and zoomed in on her credit card statements. There, buried among charges for department stores and restaurants, were payments to 3 different psychiatrists in Connecticut and New York. I'd never visited any of them. I'd never even heard their names. But according to the dates, I'd supposedly had appointments spanning 18 months, regular sessions that built a documented history of ongoing psychiatric treatment. Vivian had constructed a completely false mental health history for me over more than a year, creating paper trails with real doctors who would testify if called that, yes, they'd treated Celeste Morgan, yes, she'd exhibited concerning symptoms. It was premeditated character assassination executed with the kind of methodical patience that made my blood run cold. They hadn't decided to destroy me on a whim or in anger. They'd been building the framework for my destruction systematically, deliberately, legally, for at least 18 months before the wedding. While digging through boxes of old family documents I'd taken from the estate over the years, I found my birth certificate tucked in a folder with other childhood paperwork. I'd never really examined it closely before, why would I? But now I looked at every line, every notation, and that's when I saw it. Hospital Greenwich General. Date: March 15, 1990. Time: 7:23 a.m. And then, in small print near the bottom, Twin A, Twin A. My hands started shaking. I wasn't supposed to be a twin. I had no twin sister beyond Lily, who wasn't actually my sister at all, but adopted. Yet this official document clearly identified me as Twin A, which meant somewhere there should be documentation of Twin B. I tore through every box, every folder, searching frantically for another birth certificate, but found nothing. Finally desperate, I called Greenwich General's records department. After being transferred 3 times and speaking to increasingly senior clerks, I finally reached someone who seemed willing to help. I claimed I needed the information for medical history purposes, that I was concerned about genetic conditions, and needed to know about any siblings. There was a long pause. The sound of typing, then the clerk's voice came back quieter, almost sympathetic. "I see a death certificate filed the same day as your birth," she said carefully. "Caroline Grace Morgan, twin, B. Time of death, 7:47 a.m., just 24 minutes after you were born. Official cause of death, stillborn." But that wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true with the same certainty I knew my own name. Fragments of memory that I'd always dismissed as childhood imagination suddenly felt different, more real. The empty space in photographs. The music box with 2 names. The way my mother's face would sometimes go blank when she looked at me like she was seeing someone else, someone who wasn't there. Caroline hadn't been stillborn. Caroline had been alive. I had memories of her shadowy and incomplete but undeniably present. A companion in the garden, a sister who looked exactly like me, someone who'd been there and then wasn't. I needed more confirmation, more proof, so I tracked down Dr. Sarah Chen, my pediatrician from childhood who'd retired 5 years ago. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Westport, and when I showed her the forged medical records my parents had released to the press, her face hardened with an anger I'd never seen in her before. "I never wrote these reports," she said firmly, her finger stabbing at the pages. "This isn't even my signature close, but not quite right. Your mother called me about a year ago, asking detailed questions about your childhood medical history. She said it was for insurance purposes, updating family records. I should have known something was wrong." Dr. Chen disappeared to her car and returned with a worn leather portfolio that she explained contained copies of personal files she'd kept after retiring. "I kept notes on your mother's call because her questions were odd, specific in ways that made me uncomfortable. She asked repeatedly if you'd ever shown signs of psychological instability as a child, mood swings, aggression, paranoid ideation. When I told her no, that you were actually remarkably well adjusted despite obvious family stress, she seemed angry. She actually argued with me, suggested I might be misremembering, asked if I was certain there were no incidents I'd forgotten to document." Dr. Chen met my eyes with something like apology. "I should have reported that conversation to someone. I knew it wasn't right." Sitting in that coffee shop looking at the evidence of my mother's year-long campaign to construct a false psychiatric history for me, I finally understood the full scope of what they'd done. They'd been building my insanity like an inheritance carefully and deliberately and legally long before they ever poured poison into that glass. The evidence of their long-term planning should have broken me further, but instead it crystallized my determination into something harder and sharper than anything I'd felt before, and that clarity made me ready when the text message arrived 6 weeks after the wedding. An unknown number, just a few words, Starbucks on 42nd and 8th, 2 p.m. Come alone, L. I stared at that single letter for a long moment, knowing immediately it was Lily, and my first instinct was suspicion. Why would she contact me now? Was this another trap? Another layer of their plan? My lawyer, when I called him, advised strongly against going. You're facing attempted murder charges. Any contact with the victim could be construed as witness tampering. It's a terrible idea. But something in my gut told me this was different, that Lily reaching out meant something had shifted, so I went anyway, disguising myself with sunglasses and a hooded sweatshirt, feeling ridiculous and paranoid, but also recognizing that paranoia was probably justified given everything that had happened. Lily sat in the back corner of the Starbucks, as far from windows as possible, and I barely recognized her. She'd always been beautiful in that effortless way that had made me jealous my entire life. But now she looked like a ghost. Dark circles shadowed her eyes so deeply they looked like bruises. She'd lost at least 15 pounds from her already slim frame, her collarbones protruding sharply beneath her sweater. When I approached the table, she actually flinched, her whole body jerking backward like I might strike her. "I can't stay long," she whispered before I could even sit down. Her eyes darted toward the door, toward the windows, constantly scanning for threats. "They track my phone. I told them I had a doctor's appointment, but I only have 20 minutes before they start calling." Her hands were shaking as she reached into her purse and pulled out something small wrapped in tissue paper. She slid it across the table between our coffee cups, and when I unwrapped it, I found myself looking at a small porcelain doll, the one we'd fought over as children near the fountain, the one that had led to Lily's calculated fall, and my punishment. "Look inside," she said urgently. The doll's body had been hollowed out, and nestled in the cavity was a USB drive. I recorded everything the night before the wedding. I knew something was wrong, I could feel it, but I was too scared to stop it. "I'm so sorry, Celeste. I'm so sorry I wasn't brave enough." Tears were streaming down her face now, and she stood abruptly. "I have to go. They can't know I was here. Please just listen to it. Please." Then she was gone, practically running out of the coffee shop, leaving me holding the doll and trying to process what had just happened. Back in my apartment, I plugged the USB into my laptop with hands that shook so badly I could barely manage the connection. The file directory showed a single audio recording dated the night before my wedding, timestamp 11:47 p.m. I pressed play and heard the sound of movement fabric rustling, then my mother's voice coming through with perfect clarity. She must have been close to wherever Lily had hidden the recording device. "The dosage is perfect," Vivian was saying, her tone businesslike and cold. "She'll start showing symptoms during the ceremony itself: confusion, slurred speech, loss of motor control, possibly aggression or paranoid accusations. To everyone watching, it will look exactly like a psychotic break. The paramedics will be positioned nearby to respond immediately, which will add to the authenticity." My father's voice, next, equally calm. "And Rhodes is completely on board with the timeline." Then a third voice spoke, and my entire body went cold with recognition. Ethan. My fiancé, the man I'd been about to marry, speaking in the same calculated tone he used in business negotiations. "My lawyers have confirmed the prenuptial agreement clause. If she's accused of a felony or deemed mentally incompetent within 90 days of the ceremony, I retain the $50 million and the marriage is nullified without any liability on my part. Additionally, once she's institutionalized and you have guardianship, you'll transfer her company assets to my holding corporation as we discussed. I receive 30% as a finder's fee for my participation." Robert actually laughed, a sound of genuine pleasure. "Son, you're learning how business really works. Welcome to the family." The recording continued, and I sat frozen, listening to them discuss me like I was a commodity to be traded, an obstacle to be removed, anything except a human being they supposedly loved. They talked about the media strategy about which reporters had been pre-briefed about how Vivian had cultivated relationships with specific journalists who would frame the story exactly as they wanted. They discussed the fake medical records, congratulating themselves on their thoroughness. Every detail had been planned, every contingency accounted for. Then Lily's voice cut through, small and frightened. What if something goes wrong? What if she gets really hurt? Or what if someone figures out what we're doing? My mother's response was ice. Lily, darling, you know what happens if you don't cooperate. That situation last year with Senator Hendrick, we protected you then. We made that pregnancy disappear. We paid off the right people. We kept you safe. But we can unprotect you just as easily. His wife would be very interested to know about your affair with her husband. The press would have a field day. Your life would be over. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Lily crying softly. Then her voice defeated and hollow. I understand. I'll do what you want. The recording ended there, leaving me sitting in my apartment with tears streaming down my face, but not from sadness. From rage. From the clarifying fury of finally understanding the complete picture. My phone buzzed with another text from Lily's number. They're sending me to Switzerland tomorrow. They know I'm breaking. They know I'm not reliable anymore. Please hurry. They're going to make me disappear like they tried to make you disappear. I realized with sudden brutal clarity that I wasn't their only victim. I was just the one they'd needed destroyed completely because my destruction served their financial interests. But Lily had been a victim all along, controlled through blackmail and fear, forced to participate in my destruction under threat of her own. They'd weaponized one daughter to destroy the other, and neither of us had been anything more than assets to be managed or liabilities to be eliminated. And suddenly, I understood I wasn't their only victim. I was just the one they needed destroyed completely. Understanding that Lily had been another victim rather than a willing conspirator should have made me feel less alone. But instead, it just deepened my rage at how thoroughly my parents had manipulated everyone around them. So when someone knocked on my apartment door 2 days after that, recording, my first instinct was to ignore it completely. I'd stopped answering the door weeks ago, assuming anyone who showed up was either a reporter looking for a quote or someone who wanted to scream accusations at me. But this person was persistent, knocking steadily, and finally a voice called through the door. Ms. Morgan, my name is Marcus Chen. I'm an investigative journalist with ProPublica. I don't think you're guilty. Please just give me 5 minutes. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole at a man in his early 40s. Asian American, wearing a rumpled button-down shirt and carrying a weathered leather messenger bag. He looked exhausted and earnest, and nothing like the predatory reporters who'd been hounding me for weeks. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. I have nothing to say to journalists, I said flatly. I don't want a quote, he said quickly, holding up his hands to show he wasn't recording. I've been investigating your father, Robert Morgan, for 3 years. I think your wedding was his latest crime scene, not yours. I think you're a victim, not a perpetrator. Please let me show you what I've found. Something in his voice, some quality of absolute conviction, made me unlock the chain and let him inside. Marcus Chen moved into my apartment like he'd been preparing for this moment, immediately spreading documents across my coffee table with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd organized this presentation many times in his mind. Financial records, bank statements, corporate filings, all meticulously highlighted and annotated. Your father's real estate empire is $300 million in debt, he said without preamble, pointing to a summary sheet that made my stomach drop. His latest development project in Stamford failed catastrophically. The investors are demanding their money back, threatening lawsuits, and he has no liquid capital to satisfy them. He's been scrambling for months trying to find a way to cover the losses. I stared at the numbers, seeing the full scope of my father's desperation laid out in black and white. Marcus continued, his finger tracing connections between documents. Your design firm was recently valued at $50 million. It's the only asset in the Morgan family portfolio that's actually worth something that could be liquidated quickly or used as collateral. When you refused to merge operations with his company, when you insisted on keeping it separate, he had to find another way to access those assets. That's when he started building the framework to have you declared incompetent. How long have you known about this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I've suspected for about 18 months, but I couldn't prove it until your wedding. That's when all the pieces clicked into place. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker and older. But my investigation into Robert Morgan goes back much further than your case, and it's personal. Marcus sat back on my couch and his face transformed into something harder, more haunted. 15 years ago, my father, David Chen, was a respected architect in Connecticut. He designed this revolutionary, sustainable housing project, eco-friendly construction techniques that were ahead of their time. Your father approached him about a partnership, said he wanted to develop it together. My dad was thrilled Robert Morgan's backing meant the project would actually get built. He shared all his designs, all his proprietary techniques, everything. I could already see where this story was going, and my heart sank. 3 months later, Robert pulled out of the partnership. No explanation, just a polite letter saying he'd reconsidered. Then 3 months after that, Robert launched an almost identical project under his own company name. Same sustainable techniques, same design elements, everything my father had created. My dad sued for intellectual property theft, and Robert's lawyers buried him in litigation. Motions, counterclaims, depositions that went nowhere, legal fees that climbed into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Marcus's voice had gone rough with emotion. The stress destroyed him. The public humiliation, the financial devastation watching his reputation get shredded in court documents. He had a massive heart attack 18 months into the lawsuit. He died at 52 years old. I was 27, fresh out of journalism school, and I watched my father die believing he was a failure and a joke. "I'm so sorry," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. I've spent 15 years investigating Robert Morgan. Marcus continued, meeting my eyes with an intensity that made me understand this was his life's purpose. Building a case documenting his pattern of fraud and theft and intimidation. But he's careful, well-connected, protected by expensive lawyers and political allies. I've never been able to get close enough to prove what I know. Your case is different. Your case is public documented, and you're still technically family. You have access I'll never have. Why should I trust you? I asked, even though part of me already knew I was going to. You're a journalist. You could be using this to write an expose on me, another angle on the same story everyone else is telling. Marcus held my gaze steadily. Because we want the same thing, justice. You want your life back, your reputation restored, your freedom. I want my father's name cleared and Robert Morgan exposed for what he really is. He's the thread connecting both our destructions. Separately, we're vulnerable. Together, we might actually have a chance. He gestured to the files spread across my table, years of meticulous investigation. I have evidence of fraud, witness intimidation, a pattern of illegal behavior going back 2 decades. But I need someone on the inside, someone who can access family records, who can testify to his character and methods. You're still legally a Morgan. Together, we can expose everything. I looked at the evidence scattered between us, at this man who'd spent half his life pursuing justice for his father, at the opportunity being offered to me like a lifeline when I'd thought I was drowning. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something other than despair flooding through my veins. I felt purpose, direction, the cold clarity of having a mission that extended beyond just survival. They'd wanted me isolated and powerless, cut off from allies and resources, buried so deep I'd never climb out. Instead, they'd created someone with nothing left to lose. And that's the most dangerous enemy of all. Having nothing left to lose made me a better investigator than I ever could have been when I still believed the world was fair, and over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and I worked together with the kind of obsessive focus that comes from knowing you're fighting for survival. My apartment underwent a complete transformation, every surface covered with evidence and analysis. Whiteboards lined the walls with timelines marked in different colored markers, tracking my father's financial decline alongside the construction of my false psychiatric history. Corkboards held photographs connected by red string showing relationships between shell corporations and offshore accounts. 2 laptops ran continuously, one analyzing financial data while the other cross-referenced property records and court filings. Marcus taught me to think like an investigator rather than a victim, to follow money trails with the same precision I'd once applied to architectural designs. Pattern and practice, he'd say, repeatedly showing me how a single instance of fraud could be explained away, but 20 instances over 15 years established irrefutable criminal behavior. We identified my father's key vulnerabilities with surgical precision. 3 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, routing money through shell corporations with names like Meridian Holdings and Coastal Development Partners. Falsified property valuations used to secure loans that should never have been approved. Payments to city officials that were documented as consulting fees but lined up suspiciously with zoning approval dates. The wedding conspiracy was harder to prove despite having Lily's recording, and Marcus explained the legal problem with frustrating patience. Connecticut was a 2-party consent state, meaning all parties to a conversation had to consent to being recorded, or the audio was inadmissible in criminal court. Lily had recorded without anyone's knowledge or permission, which meant the recording that proved everything might not be usable as evidence. But Marcus said, his eyes bright with the kind of strategic thinking that made him an excellent journalist. It gives us a roadmap. We know what they said, what they planned, what motivated them. We just need to get them to say it again under circumstances where recording is legal. That's when Marcus mentioned his contact at the FBI, and suddenly our amateur investigation gained the weight of federal authority behind it. Special Agent Rachel Torres worked in the white-collar crime division and had apparently been monitoring Robert Morgan's financial activities for 2 years as part of a broader investigation into real estate fraud and money laundering throughout Connecticut. Marcus arranged a meeting at a coffee shop in Stamford, someplace public enough to seem casual but private enough for sensitive conversation. Agent Torres was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and direct in a way I immediately appreciated after weeks of people either avoiding me entirely or approaching with false sympathy. She listened to Lily's recording through headphones, her expression never changing, then reviewed the financial documents Marcus had compiled. When she finally leaned back in her chair, I held my breath waiting for her assessment. "The recording can't be used to prosecute the assault charge," she said bluntly, confirming what Marcus had already told me. 2-party consent laws are clear, but it gives us probable cause to investigate the underlying financial crimes, the conspiracy to commit fraud, the extortion of both you and your sister, the money laundering we've been tracking. If we can prove those charges, we can flip this entire case on its head. You stop being the defendant and become a witness to your father's criminal enterprise. She proposed something I hadn't even considered, a sting operation where we'd get Robert or Vivian to confess the wedding plot again, but this time under circumstances where recording was completely legal. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would request a private family mediation session through my lawyer, claiming I wanted to resolve things quietly before the trial, perhaps negotiate a plea arrangement. My parents, confident in their control and eager to avoid the uncertainty of a trial, would likely agree. It would seem like their victory, their chance to pressure me into accepting guilt for reduced charges. The meeting would be held at a neutral attorney's office that Agent Torres would arrange. Marcus would pose as a professional mediator, someone brought in to facilitate difficult family discussions. The room would be equipped with FBI surveillance equipment under a court-approved warrant, making everything that happened there completely legal and admissible. Federal agents would be positioned nearby, ready to move in once we had what we needed. The goal, Torres explained with the calm professionalism of someone who'd run dozens of these operations, is to get them comfortable enough to brag. We need them to reference the plan, the drugging, the financial motives behind wanting you institutionalized. Narcissists love explaining how clever they are, especially when they think they've won. Your job is to play defeated, to seem like you're ready to give up. Give them the space to gloat and let them hang themselves with their own words. I thought about all the years I'd spent being silent, being obedient, making myself small and invisible to avoid my parents' displeasure. I thought about how they'd weaponized my compliance, used my desperate need for their approval to control every aspect of my life. Now that same silence would become something different. Now I would sit quietly and let them confess, Let them explain in their own words exactly how they'd destroyed me, and every word would be recorded with federal authority. Marcus looked at me across the coffee shop table, reading the determination in my face. "Are you sure you can do this? Sitting across from them pretending to be broken when you're actually fighting back?" "I've been pretending my whole life," I said, and my voice was steady and cold. The difference is, this time I know I'm acting. They'd taught me to be silent, obedient, invisible, grooming me from childhood to accept whatever they decided was best. Now silence would become their confession, and I would be the one listening. Learning to weaponize my own silence felt like discovering I'd had a superpower all along, but had never known how to use it. And as we finalized the plan for the mediation, I realized that everything my parents had taught me about performance and control was about to be turned against them. Through my lawyer, I sent a formal mediation request that had been drafted and redrafted a dozen times until every word conveyed exactly the right tone of exhausted defeat. The letter explained that I was overwhelmed by the public attention, emotionally drained by the ongoing investigation, and desperately wanted to find a path forward that honored our family bonds. I expressed openness to discussing a settlement, to hearing their perspective, to finding resolution that would spare us all the trauma of a trial. It was exactly what Robert wanted to hear: submission disguised as negotiation, his difficult daughter finally broken and ready to accept his terms. He responded within 2 hours, his lawyer's email arriving, with almost eager speed agreeing to the mediation and suggesting a Midtown Manhattan law office as neutral territory. The date was set for 3 days away, just enough time for them to feel confident, but not enough for them to overthink or become suspicious. I read that email 3 times, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. He was taking the bait perfectly. Vivian called me directly that same evening, which was unusual enough that my hands shook when I saw her name on my phone screen. I almost didn't answer, but Agent Torres had coached me on this possibility, had told me to stay in character no matter what. "Darling?" My mother's voice came through, dripping with false maternal concern. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. This whole ugly situation has hurt all of us so deeply. Your father and I just want what's best for you, what's best for the family. Let's sit down together and find a solution that works for everyone." I forced my voice to crack slightly to sound tired and defeated in exactly the way she'd expect. "I just want it to stop, Mom. I can't take any more of this. Please, can we just make it stop?" The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but I heard her satisfied sigh on the other end, heard her belief that she'd won, and I knew I was playing the role perfectly. The night before the mediation, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for over an hour, studying my own face like it belonged to a stranger I was learning to impersonate. I'd lost 15 pounds since the wedding, and my cheekbones were sharp enough now to cast shadows in certain light. But it was my eyes that had changed most dramatically. They were harder than they'd ever been, calculating in ways I wouldn't have recognized 3 months ago. I practiced expressions methodically, vulnerability with just a hint of confusion, sadness that looked genuine but not theatrical, the slight tremble of someone barely holding themselves together. I rehearsed breaking down in tears, letting my voice crack at precisely the right moments, and I was disturbed by how naturally it came to me after a lifetime of emotional performance. Marcus sat on my couch watching this preparation with something like awe mixed with concern. "You're really good at this," he observed quietly. "Almost too good. Are you sure you're okay?" "I've been performing my whole life for them," I replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror's reflection. Every dinner, every family event, every interaction was a performance where I played the role they assigned me. The difference is, this time I know I'm acting. This time I'm in control of the script. I turned away from the mirror and showed him the outfit I'd selected: a simple black dress, conservative and elegant, the kind of thing you'd wear to a funeral or a very serious business meeting. Minimal jewelry, just small pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's. Hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized how gaunt my face had become. I needed to look defeated but still dignified, broken but not completely destroyed. The visual had to support the narrative I was selling. The morning of the mediation arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel hyper-real. Agent Torres met me in a parking garage 2 blocks from the law office, and in the back of an unmarked vehicle she fitted me with a wire so thin and sophisticated that I couldn't feel it even when I knew exactly where it was. The adhesive tape between my shoulder blades held the tiny microphone in place, and she showed me the battery pack that would clip to my bra strap, invisible beneath my dress. "Keep them talking," she instructed one final time, her hands steady and professional as she adjusted the equipment. "The more details they volunteer, the more specific they get about dates and plans and motives, the stronger our case becomes. Your job is just to be present and let them fill the silence. Can you do that?" "I can do that." I said and meant it with every fiber of my being. In the law office building, FBI agents had already positioned themselves with the kind of invisible efficiency that comes from years of practice. 2 agents sat in an unmarked van on the street outside, monitoring audio feeds and ready to move on Torres's signal. 2 more were disguised as building maintenance workers loitering in the hallway near the conference room with toolboxes that contained considerably more than tools. Torres herself would be in an adjacent conference room behind a 2-way mirror, watching and listening, recording everything with equipment that had been court-approved and warranted. The conference room itself had been transformed into a surveillance operation disguised as a neutral meeting space. 4 hidden cameras were positioned at different angles to capture every face, every expression, every gesture. Backup recording devices had been embedded in the overhead lights tucked into the pen holder on the central table, even concealed in the base of the water pitcher that sat on the credenza. They couldn't afford any technical failure, any gap in coverage, any moment that wasn't captured with perfect clarity. If Robert or Vivian even hinted at the conspiracy, if they gave us anything we could use, every word would be preserved with federal authority. Marcus, wearing a suit that made him look like a professional mediator instead of an investigative journalist, gave me one last look before we entered the building. "You don't have to do this. We can find another way." "There is no other way," I said simply. "This ends today, one way or another." As I walked through the building's lobby toward the elevator that would take me to the conference room, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't nervous anymore. I wasn't afraid. I was focused with the kind of clarity that comes from having absolute purpose. As I walked toward that conference room, I wasn't just fighting for my freedom or my reputation. I was hunting the monsters who'd raised me, who'd tried to destroy me, who'd spent my entire life teaching me to be prey. Today I would show them what happens when prey learns to hunt back. The monsters I was hunting walked into that conference room dressed in the armor of respectability, and I had to suppress every instinct to run, because sitting across from them felt like volunteering to be devoured. Robert wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Vivian was elegant in navy blue, her hair and makeup perfect, both of them projecting the concerned parental authority they'd spent decades cultivating. They looked like people who belonged in positions of power, who deserved respect, who would never do anything as sordid as drugging their own daughter. Marcus, wearing a suit that transformed him into a convincing professional mediator, guided us through opening pleasantries with the kind of careful neutrality someone in his supposed position would employ. He thanked everyone for coming, acknowledged the difficulty of the situation, and outlined the goal of finding common ground. I played my role exactly as we'd rehearsed, keeping my eyes downcast, my posture slightly hunched, my voice trembling when I finally spoke. "I don't understand how everything went so wrong," I said, and I was proud of how authentic the confusion in my voice sounded. "I never meant to hurt Lily. I would never hurt my sister, but everyone believes I did, and I don't know how to make anyone understand." I let my voice break slightly on the last word, let a single tear slide down my cheek that I didn't wipe away. Vivian's response was immediate and perfectly calculated. She reached across the polished conference table and took my hand in both of hers, her skin soft and her grip gentle in a parody of maternal comfort. "We know, darling. We know you didn't mean for any of this to happen. You've been under so much stress for so long, the wedding planning, the pressure from the business, all that anxiety you've struggled with for years. Your father and I should have seen the signs earlier. We should have insisted you get help before things reached this point." Robert nodded gravely, playing his part in their choreographed performance. "What matters now isn't assigning blame. What matters is making this right, finding a path forward that protects everyone involved. If you agree to certain terms, entering a treatment facility where you can get the psychiatric help you clearly need, reorganizing your business structure so the company can continue operating while you focus on recovery, we can present a unified front to the prosecutors. We have influence connections. The charges might be reduced to something manageable if we show the court you're taking responsibility and seeking help." I watched them work, marveling at how smoothly they operated as a team, how seamlessly they wove truth and lies together until the fabric seemed whole. This was what they'd always done, I realized. This was how they'd controlled every situation, every narrative, every person who'd ever threatened their carefully constructed world. Marcus, following the script we'd developed, began asking more specific questions with the casual curiosity of someone just trying to understand the timeline. "Mrs. Morgan, to help clarify the sequence of events, can you walk me through exactly what happened with the champagne that morning, just for my notes so we have a clear record?" Vivian settled back in her chair, comfortable now, confident she was in control. "Of course. It was just a normal mother-daughter moment before the ceremony. I brought Celeste a glass of champagne in the bridal suite for a private toast, a tradition in our family. We talked, we shared that moment together, and then she went down to the ceremony." Robert interrupted with the impatient tone of someone who thought we were wasting time on irrelevant details. "Look what happened. Celeste had a breakdown during the ceremony. Lily tried to help her and somehow ended up drinking something she shouldn't have. It was chaotic. The point now is damage control, not rehashing every detail." But Marcus pressed forward, his voice still neutral but his questions becoming more pointed. "I understand, Mr. Morgan, but there's been considerable speculation in the media about the substance found in Lily's bloodstream. The benzodiazepine, can you address that directly? It might help if we can explain the medical aspects clearly." Robert's eyes flashed with irritation, and I saw the exact moment his arrogance overrode his caution. That benzodiazepine was meant to calm wedding day nerves, nothing more. Unfortunately, the dosage was miscalculated. These things happen when you're trying to help someone who won't help themselves. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain they could hear it, but I kept my face neutral, kept playing the defeated daughter. Marcus leaned forward slightly, and I knew we were approaching the critical moment. "Who miscalculated the dosage, Mr. Morgan, for the record?" I watched Vivian's face and saw the exact instant she understood what was happening. Color drained from her cheeks, and her hand tightened on the table edge until her knuckles went white. She opened her mouth to stop Robert to salvage the situation, but he was already speaking, his tone defensive and dismissive. "My wife prepared it based on our research, but I approved the quantity. We're not medical professionals, obviously, but we thought a mild sedative would help Celeste get through the day without another panic attack, without embarrassing herself and the family in front of 200 guests. Obviously, someone mixing it with alcohol before the ceremony was a mistake we didn't anticipate." Marcus's voice was quiet but clear. "So you're confirming that you knowingly drugged your daughter without her knowledge or consent?" The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own breathing, could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, could hear Robert's sharp intake of breath as he finally understood he'd been led into a trap. His lawyer instincts kicked in immediately, his face smoothing into professional neutrality, his voice becoming carefully measured. "I'm saying we tried to help our daughter using methods that in retrospect were poorly chosen. There was a tragic accident. We take responsibility for our role in that accident, but intent matters, and our intent was always to protect Celeste from herself." The conference room door opened before he could continue his backtracking, and Agent Torres stepped through with her badge displayed and 3 other federal agents behind her. Her voice was level and professional, carrying the weight of federal authority. Robert Morgan and Vivian Morgan, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault with intent to incapacitate, extortion, wire fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I watched my father's face as the agents moved to either side of him as handcuffs were produced, and his hands were pulled behind his back. For the first time in my entire life, I saw his power crumble. Not to a business rival, not to a market downturn, not to any of the forces he'd spent decades learning to control and manipulate. His power crumbled because of me. The daughter he'd never thought mattered, the one he'd tried to bury alive, the one who'd learned to hunt by being hunted. And for the first time in my life, I watched my father's power crumble not to a rival, but to the daughter he never thought mattered. Watching my father's power crumble should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt oddly hollow, like I'd spent so much energy preparing for this moment that I'd forgotten to imagine what would come after it. Robert erupted with the kind of controlled fury I'd seen him direct at business rivals and incompetent employees. His voice tight with rage, even as the agents secured his hands behind his back. "You have no idea what you've done, Celeste. The legal fees alone will destroy you. Every connection you think you have in this city I built. Every door that's ever opened for you, I opened. You'll be finished before this is over." But his threats were empty now, just words without the power structure that had always made them real, and even he seemed to realize it as his voice trailed off. Vivian was silent beside him, staring down at her handcuffed wrists with an expression of absolute disbelief, as if she couldn't quite comprehend how the world had inverted so completely. This was the first real crack I'd ever seen in her perfect composure, the first moment where the mask slipped entirely, and I saw genuine shock underneath. She didn't look at me, didn't speak, just stood there frozen, as if her entire understanding of reality had short-circuited. As the agents led them toward the hallway, I followed at a distance, watching this surreal procession of my parents being escorted like common criminals through a law office where they'd probably conducted business dozens of times before. Other FBI agents were waiting in the corridor, and I realized this had been coordinated down to the minute, every movement planned and executed with precision. I stood there watching my parents, the twin pillars of my childhood nightmares, the architects of my destruction, reduced to people being read their Miranda rights in voices that were professional and utterly indifferent to their status or wealth or connections. Robert turned his head just before they reached the elevator, and his eyes found mine across the crowded hallway. "You'll regret this," he said, and even now, even handcuffed and arrested, he tried to make it sound like a promise he could keep. "Family is everything, Celeste. You've destroyed the only thing that mattered." Something inside me that had been coiled tight for 35 years finally released, and I heard my own voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "You were never family. You were a prison, and I just walked free." I saw him flinch, saw something that might have been genuine emotion flicker across his face, before the elevator doors closed, and he was gone. Agent Torres appeared at my elbow, her hand briefly touching my shoulder in a gesture that was probably against protocol, but deeply human. "Are you okay?" she asked, and I didn't know how to answer that question because I wasn't sure what okay was supposed to feel like anymore. "What happens now?" I asked instead. "Now we execute phase 2, she said, and there was something almost like satisfaction in her voice as she pulled out her tablet and showed me a split screen of 2 locations. Ethan Rhodes. I'd almost forgotten about Ethan in the intensity of confronting my parents, but Torres and her team hadn't forgotten anything. The FBI already had warrants based on Lily's recording and the confession they'd just captured, and as I watched the tablet screen, federal agents arrived simultaneously at Ethan's Tribeca penthouse and his corporate headquarters in Midtown. The coordination was flawless, timed to prevent him from being warned or having any chance to destroy evidence or flee. The news crews, always hovering near power like flies near honey, caught everything. I watched on Torres's tablet as breaking news banners erupted across every channel. Tech CEO arrested in wedding poisoning conspiracy. Ethan's perfect facade, that carefully cultivated image of the young billionaire genius, shattered in real time across every screen in America. The footage showed him being led from his building in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and rage, while reporters swarmed and shouted questions he couldn't answer because the agents were already reading him his rights. His board of directors, those men in expensive suits who'd congratulated him at our engagement party, held an emergency meeting and suspended him within 2 hours. The company's stock price plummeted as investors panicked, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value before trading was halted. The man who'd abandoned me at my lowest point to protect his reputation and his fortune had lost both in less than 4 hours. The prenuptial agreement clause he'd so cleverly engineered to keep his $50 million, the one that would activate if I was accused of a felony, had become his legal nightmare, because now he was the one facing felony charges. The media narrative reversed itself with a speed that would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. The same outlets that had crucified me, that had turned me into America's most hated woman, now scrambled desperately to tell the real story, as if they hadn't been instrumental in burying the truth for months. ProPublica published Marcus's comprehensive investigation that same afternoon, The Morgan Family Conspiracy: How a Wealthy Connecticut Family Framed Their Daughter for Profit. CNN ran a 2-hour special called Celeste Morgan Victim Not Villain, with legal experts and psychologists analyzing exactly how I'd been manipulated and destroyed. My email inbox, which I'd stopped checking weeks ago because it was nothing but hate mail, suddenly flooded with messages from former clients apologizing and wanting to resume our professional relationships. Friends who'd ghosted me completely sent long explanatory texts about how they'd been confused by the media coverage, but had always believed in me deep down. Colleagues who'd publicly distanced themselves now wanted to meet for coffee and discuss future collaborations. The Change.org petition demanding my arrest and prosecution was quietly deleted, and within an hour a new one appeared: Exonerate Celeste Morgan and Restore Her Reputation. It reached 100,000 signatures in 2 hours. I sat in Agent Torres's office watching this reversal cascade across every platform, every screen, every corner of the internet that had so recently been calling for my blood, and I felt absolutely nothing. No relief, no vindication, no satisfaction. Just a bone-deep exhaustion and a kind of emptiness that scared me more than the hatred had. Marcus found me there an hour later, still staring at the tablet screen, watching my redemption unfold in real time. "You did it," he said quietly, sitting beside me. "You won." "Did I?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. "They destroyed my reputation in 1 day, Marcus. It took months of investigation and one carefully orchestrated confession to give it back. But some things once broken never heal the same way. Every person who believed I was a murderer, every friend who abandoned me, every client who fired me, they showed me who they really were. Getting my reputation back doesn't erase that knowledge. They'd stolen my reputation in 1 day with their perfectly crafted lies. It took one recording to give it back, backed by federal authority and overwhelming evidence. But some things once broken never heal the same way. The knowledge that some things never heal the same way should have prepared me for what I was about to discover, but nothing could have truly prepared me for understanding the full scope of my mother's hatred and how deep its roots went. With Robert and Vivian both in jail awaiting trial, I gained legal access to family records as part of the civil lawsuit my attorney had filed to recover damages and clear my name completely. Marcus helped me sort through decades of documents that had been stored in the Morgan Estate's library boxes and filing cabinets that my parents had kept locked and private for reasons I was only beginning to understand. We found them in the back of a climate-controlled storage closet, sealed boxes labeled Personal Confidential in my father's precise handwriting. Inside were hospital records from 1990, including a death certificate for Caroline Grace Morgan that listed her as Twin B, and then something I hadn't expected at all: Vivian's psychiatric evaluation records from 1993, 3 years after our birth, documenting a hospitalization that I'd never known about. The evaluation was extensive, clearly the result of weeks of inpatient treatment, and as I read through the clinical notes, I felt my understanding of my entire childhood shift and reform into a new and terrible shape. The diagnosis was severe postpartum depression complicated by PTSD following Caroline's death. But it was the doctor's observations that made my hands shake as I held those yellowed pages. Patient exhibits selective attachment disorder with surviving twin. One note read in detached clinical language. States repeatedly that she can't look at Celeste without seeing Caroline's absence. Patient describes intrusive thoughts of harming surviving child followed by intense guilt. Recommend continued treatment and careful monitoring of mother-child interaction. Saying. I sat on the library floor surrounded by boxes and decades of family secrets, and I realized that my mother had been diagnosing me with mental illness while she herself had been hospitalized for wanting to harm me. The irony was so dark it felt like choking. Marcus found the accident report filed by the Greenwich Police Department, and as he handed it to me with a look of deep sympathy, I understood why Vivian had kept these records locked away. Caroline hadn't died at birth like the official story claimed, like I'd been told by the sympathetic hospital clerk. She drowned at age 3 in the estate's swimming pool. The report was brief, but devastating in its details. Child wandered to pool area unsupervised during afternoon hours. Celeste Morgan, age 3, found standing at pool edge, clothing wet, screaming for mother. Child could not explain coherently what had occurred. Mother Vivian Morgan arrived on scene, pulled deceased child from water, attempted resuscitation unsuccessfully. The investigating officer had added notes that were more personal than professional. Mother appears to blame surviving twin, made several statements suggesting older child pushed younger into water. However, no evidence supports this theory. 3-year-old witness testimony, unreliable. Father Robert Morgan extremely controlling of interview process, pressuring for immediate accidental death ruling. Recommended follow-up investigation denied by family attorney. My childhood memory fragments suddenly assembled themselves into a coherent picture that I wished I could unsee. The empty space in photographs wasn't imaginary. It was where Caroline should have been standing. The music box with 2 names engraved on the bracelet was ours, meant to be shared between twins. My mother's inexplicable coldness, the way she sometimes looked at me with something approaching horror, the decades of comparison and criticism and withholding love. It all made terrible sense now. I wasn't unloved because I was fundamentally unlovable. I was unloved because my mother couldn't separate me from my dead sister, couldn't look at me without being reminded of the child she'd lost. Grief had poisoned her heart, and I had paid the price for 32 years for a tragedy that happened when I was 3 years old. But the revelation that broke something inside me was in the adoption papers Marcus found in another box. Lily had been adopted at age 2, exactly 1 year after Caroline's death. The notes from the adoption agency were specific and chilling. Mother Vivian Morgan requesting female child age 2 to 3, brunette hair to complete the family. Mother states she wants a daughter who reminds her of lost child but without the trauma of the surviving twins' presence. Lily was literally chosen to replace Caroline. Every moment of favoritism, every instance of excessive protection, every demonstration of desperate maternal love that I'd envied my entire life, none of it had actually been about Lily as a person. She was a do-over, a second chance for Vivian to mother a daughter without the contamination of Caroline's death. Both of us had been ghosts in our mother's mind. I was the reminder of death and loss, the survivor who shouldn't have survived, and Lily was the substitute for the dead, valued only because she could be molded into the daughter Vivian had lost. Neither of us had ever been seen as ourselves, as real people, with our own identities deserving of unconditional love. The realization was devastating and clarifying simultaneously, grief and relief mixing into something I had no name for. I wasn't their daughter, I was their walking, breathing reminder of the child they couldn't save. And Lily wasn't their princess, she was their desperate attempt to resurrect the dead. Understanding that both Lily and I had been ghosts in our mother's damaged mind should have made me angrier. But instead, it created space for something I hadn't expected, forgiveness, or at least the possibility of it. 2 weeks after discovering the truth about Caroline, Lily was brought back from Switzerland by FBI escort to testify before the grand jury. Agent Torres called to let me know she'd arrived, and I felt my stomach clench with a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me was still angry at Lily for her role in my destruction, but a larger part now understood that she'd been as much a victim as I was, just trapped in a different cage. We met in Agent Torres's office before the testimony, and when Lily walked through the door, I barely recognized her. She looked simultaneously older and younger than the last time I'd seen her at that Starbucks, as if being freed from our parents' manipulation had stripped away some false veneer, but revealed raw wounds underneath. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost, but her eyes carried a haunted quality that I suspected would take years to fade if it ever did. We stood facing each other for a long moment, and I didn't know whether to hug her or keep my distance, whether we were enemies or allies, or something more complicated than either. Lily spoke first, her voice steady, despite the tears already forming in her eyes. "I'm going to tell them everything today. The pregnancy with Senator Hendrick, the way they blackmailed me into silence, how they forced me to participate in destroying you. I should have spoken up at the wedding. I should have stopped it before it went that far. I knew what they were planning, and I just let it happen because I was too scared to stand up to them." I found myself reaching for her hand before I consciously decided to move, and when our fingers touched something inside me that had been clenched tight for months, finally loosened. "You were scared. I understand that now. They had leverage over you just like they tried to get leverage over me. You were surviving the only way you knew how." Lily shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "Being scared isn't an excuse, Celeste. You were terrified too, and you still fought back. I let them destroy you because it was easier than risking my own destruction. That makes me complicit. That makes me guilty." "It makes you human," I said quietly, and I meant it. "We were both trapped in their system. You just had different bars on your cage." Agent Torres gave us privacy for another 20 minutes before Lily had to go testify, and in that time we didn't say much else, just sat together in silence that felt more honest than any conversation we'd had in our entire lives. When Torres came to collect her, Lily squeezed my hand once more and whispered, "I'm going to make this right, whatever it takes." I wasn't allowed in the grand jury room. Those proceedings are secret by law, but Agent Torres briefed me afterward on what Lily had said, and I sat in Torres's office listening to the summary with something like awe. Lily had detailed everything, the systematic emotional abuse both of us had endured, growing up the way our parents had used Caroline's death to control and manipulate us, the specific timeline of how Robert had planned the wedding conspiracy to gain access to my company's assets. She confirmed that Ethan had been a willing participant, that he'd negotiated his involvement in exchange for keeping the $50 million prenuptial payment and receiving future business contracts once my assets were under Robert's control. Most importantly, Lily admitted her own role without trying to minimize or justify it. She told them about the pregnancy, about how our parents had used that scandal as leverage to force her cooperation. They told me if I didn't help them destroy Celeste, they would publicly expose my affair with a married senator. They said they'd make sure I was destroyed the same way they were planning to destroy her. And I believed them because I'd seen what they were capable of. But that doesn't make it right. I was a coward, and my cowardice nearly cost my sister everything. Torres said the grand jury had been visibly moved by Lily's testimony, and they'd returned indictments on multiple counts: conspiracy to commit assault with intent to incapacitate, extortion, wire fraud, money laundering through the offshore accounts Marcus had uncovered. Robert and Vivian's bail was immediately revoked based on the severity of the charges and the strength of the evidence. They would await trial in jail, rather than in the comfort of their estate. And I felt a grim satisfaction knowing they'd be experiencing even a fraction of the powerlessness they'd forced on me. After the testimony concluded, Lily came to my apartment. It was the first time she'd been there in over a year, and we sat on my couch like strangers learning how to be family. For hours we talked with an honesty that had never existed between us before. Lily cried as she confessed things I'd never known. "I was so jealous of you growing up. You were brilliant and talented and strong, everything I wasn't. I was just pretty, and I knew that was all I had. And then when I found out about Caroline, when I realized Mom only loved me because I reminded her of a dead child, I understood that I wasn't even real to her. I was just a replacement. Neither of us was ever actually seen. My anger at her, which had burned so hot for so long, softened into something more like shared grief. We were both victims of the same toxic system, just assigned different roles in our parents' psychological drama. I'd been cast as the scapegoat, the one who carried all the family's dysfunction and shame. Lily had been cast as the golden child, the one who had to be perfect to make up for Caroline's loss. Neither role had left room for us to be actual people with our own identities and desires. "We can't erase what happened," I said finally, as the afternoon light faded into evening. "We can't undo the damage they did to both of us. But we can choose what happens next. We can choose to be different than they were." Lily nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "We're free now. They can't control us anymore. But I don't even know what that means. What do we do with freedom?" I didn't have an answer to that question, not yet. Freedom after a lifetime of control feels less like liberation and more like standing in an empty field with no landmarks to guide you. But as we sat there together, two sisters who'd been pitted against each other for 3 decades, finally choosing to be on the same side, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the wedding hope. For the first time in our lives, we weren't the daughters they'd created to fulfill their needs and carry their trauma. We were sisters, choosing each other. Choosing each other was easier said than done after a lifetime of being weaponized against one another, but Lily and I were committed to trying, and that commitment carried us through the months of trial preparation and into the courtroom where our parents would finally face public judgment. The trial became a media sensation in ways that made my previous infamy look like a footnote, with reporters camping outside the federal courthouse and legal analysts dissecting every moment of testimony on cable news. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Way, who'd built her career on white-collar crime cases, presented evidence so overwhelming that even I, who'd lived through it all, found myself stunned by the scope of my parents' conspiracy. Lily's recording was ruled admissible not for the assault charges directly, but as evidence of the broader conspiracy to commit fraud and extortion, which gave the prosecution the foundation they needed. The FBI surveillance video from the mediation showed Robert and Vivian confessing in their own words, their voices clear and their intent unmistakable. Financial records that Marcus had helped uncover proved Robert's motive beyond any doubt. His company was drowning in debt, and my $50 million firm was the only asset liquid enough to save him. Expert witnesses testified about benzodiazepine, explaining in clinical detail how the dosage my mother had used was calculated specifically to cause behavioral symptoms that would mimic a psychiatric breakdown without causing death. The intent wasn't murder, they confirmed, but incapacitation for the purpose of involuntary commitment and seizure of assets. I testified for 3 hours on the 4th day of trial, and I'd never felt more exposed in my entire life. Catherine Way walked me through my childhood with careful, precise questions that built a picture of systematic emotional abuse and manipulation. I recounted the comparisons, the withholding of affection, the way every achievement was dismissed while Lily's smallest accomplishments were celebrated. I described the wedding day in excruciating detail, seeing my mother drop something into the champagne, switching the glasses with Lily watching my sister collapse, while my mother immediately accused me. I kept my voice steady and factual, refusing to let emotion overwhelm the testimony, and I saw several jurors wiping their eyes as I spoke. The defense attorney, an expensive lawyer from Manhattan who specialized in defending wealthy criminals, tried to paint me as a vengeful daughter fabricating elaborate conspiracies because I couldn't accept my own mental illness. But Marcus's investigation had provided too much corroboration, too many witnesses, too much documentary evidence for that narrative to gain any traction. Former employees of my father's company testified about fraudulent property valuations and bribed officials. Medical experts confirmed that my mother, as a former attorney with extensive research capabilities, would have understood exactly what effects the drug would cause. The defense's case crumbled under the weight of facts. Ethan had been tried separately and had taken a plea deal agreeing to testify against my parents in exchange for reduced charges. Watching him on the witness stand was surreal. This man who'd promised to love me forever, who'd abandoned me the moment things became difficult now, explaining in careful legal language how he'd negotiated his participation in the conspiracy. Under cross-examination, his betrayal of me was laid completely bare. He admitted he'd never loved me, that the engagement had been a business arrangement from the start, that my parents had offered him lucrative contracts and the $50 million from the prenuptial agreement if he helped them gain control of my company. His voice never wavered, never showed remorse, and I realized I'd never actually known him at all. On the 8th day of trial, Vivian took the stand against her lawyer's advice, and I watched my mother unravel in real time. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was coming loose from its pins. Her makeup was smudged, applied with a shaking hand that morning. She gripped the witness box railing so hard her knuckles were white, and her hands trembled visibly as Catherine Way began questioning her. Under prosecution questioning, my mother admitted drugging the champagne but tried desperately to reframe it as maternal concern. "I was trying to help her," she said, her voice rising with defensive panic. "Celeste has always been so difficult, so unstable. I thought if she appeared impaired during the wedding, we could finally get her into a facility where she'd receive proper psychiatric treatment. Everything I did was for her own good." Catherine Way presented evidence with devastating precision receipts for the drugs purchased under a false name, the forged medical records that had taken 18 months to construct proof that Vivian had tipped off specific reporters to be at the wedding to capture my supposed breakdown. She showed emails between Vivian and Robert discussing exactly how they'd institutionalize me and seize my assets. Confronted with contradiction after contradiction with evidence that showed calculation rather than concern, my mother finally snapped. "You don't understand," she screamed. Her composure completely shattered, now tears streaming down her face. "She should have been grateful. After Caroline died, after I lost my real daughter, I still gave Celeste a home. A name, everything. She should have appreciated what I sacrificed to keep her. But she was always there, always reminding me of what I'd lost, and she wouldn't even let me have her company when we needed it. She was selfish and ungrateful, and she deserved what happened." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment, everyone frozen in shock at what they'd just heard. My mother seemed to realize what she'd said, her hand flying to her mouth, but it was too late. The confession was complete, captured by court reporters and broadcast to the world. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. I sat beside Lily in the gallery, our hands clasped together, and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was still holding me captive. Sentencing occurred 3 weeks later. Robert received 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and extortion. Vivian received 8 years for conspiracy assault with intent to incapacitate and witness tampering. Both were ordered to pay $50 million in restitution to me for damages and to forfeit all jointly held assets to cover their legal debts to defrauded investors. Ethan, with his plea deal, received 3 years plus 5 years of probation. His company's board had already forced him to resign and sell his shares at a devastating loss. The Morgan empire that had taken 3 generations to build collapsed in 8 months. I attended the sentencing and watched the judge pronounce their fates, and I felt no triumph, no vindication, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, sad closure, like watching the final chapter of a tragedy that never should have been written. Justice was supposed to feel like victory. Instead, it felt like watching a building burn, satisfying and tragic all at once. The tragedy of watching justice unfold was supposed to bring closure, but instead it left me with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered, which is why when the letter arrived 6 months after sentencing, my first instinct was to burn it without reading. I'd moved to a new apartment in Brooklyn, unable to continue living in the space where I'd been hunted and isolated, where every corner held memories of my lowest moments. The new place was smaller, simpler, with large windows that let in actual sunlight, and I was slowly learning what it felt like to exist without constantly looking over my shoulder. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately, despite the cheap prison stationery. Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut. My hands shook as I held it, and I stood in my kitchen for a long time just staring at those elegant loops and curves that had signed report cards and birthday cards and legal documents throughout my entire life. Part of me wanted to tear it up without reading it to deny her even this final attempt at communication. Part of me was desperately, pathetically curious about what she could possibly have to say now that everything was over. Marcus was visiting for dinner that evening. We'd fallen into a comfortable friendship over the months built on shared trauma and the strange intimacy of having fought a war together. When he arrived and saw me still standing in the kitchen holding the unopened letter, he didn't ask questions, just put down the groceries he'd brought and stood beside me in quiet solidarity. "You don't have to read it," he said after a long silence. "You don't owe her anything, including your attention. But you might regret not knowing what it says. That's the kind of thing that haunts you later." I opened it with Marcus sitting across from me at my kitchen table, moral support in human form. The letter was 12 pages handwritten on lined paper, my mother's elegant script filling every line with barely any margins. It began, "Dear Celeste, I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve understanding. But I need you to know the truth, not the legal truth that was presented in court, but the real truth that I've carried for 32 years. What followed was the most honest communication my mother had ever given me, and it was devastating in its raw confession. She wrote about Caroline's death with a detail that made me feel like I was there, like I was reliving that afternoon through her eyes. She and Robert had been arguing on the phone about one of his affairs. There had been many over the years, she noted with bitter resignation, and she'd been so focused on the fight that she hadn't been watching us play by the pool. She heard my screaming and ran outside to find Caroline floating face down in the water and me in the pool trying desperately to pull my sister out. My 3-year-old arms not strong enough to lift her, my voice hoarse from screaming for help. "You were trying to save her," my mother wrote, and I could see the tear stains on the paper where her pen had smudged. "You jumped in when she fell, you tried to pull her out, you screamed for me. But when I got there and saw Caroline dead and you alive, something broke in my mind. I screamed at you. What did you do? I accused you in that moment, and even though the investigation proved it was my negligence, even though everyone told me you'd tried to help, I couldn't let go of that first instinct to blame you. It was easier than accepting that I'd killed my own daughter by not watching her, by being more focused on your father's betrayal than on my children's safety." She described how that accusation, that moment of transferred guilt, had poisoned every interaction between us from that day forward. "I convinced myself you were somehow responsible," she wrote. "I created a narrative in my mind where you were the difficult child, the one who caused problems, because if you were bad, then maybe Caroline's death made sense as some kind of cosmic justice. I know how insane that sounds. I know how cruel it was. But grief doesn't follow logic. Celeste and I let my grief turn into something toxic that I fed you like poison for 32 years. The letter continued, and my mother's handwriting became shakier, less controlled, as if the act of writing this confession was physically painful. "I did love you once when you were first born. You were my strong one, my fighter, the baby who came out screaming and determined. But after Caroline died, that strength became a reminder that you survived, and she didn't. I resented you for breathing, for growing, for being alive when my perfect angel was dead. When we adopted Lily, I saw it as a chance to start over, to have a daughter who wasn't complicated by grief and guilt and blame. I could love her easily because she didn't carry Caroline's death in her eyes. She was innocent of everything, and you, through no fault of your own, represented my greatest failure." My mother wrote about the conspiracy with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she'd spent months in therapy trying to understand her own actions. "I'm not telling you this to excuse what I did. There is no excuse. I'm telling you so you understand that you weren't unlovable. You were never the problem. I was broken, and I broke you in the process, and I will carry that guilt for whatever remains of my life. You deserved a mother who could separate her own trauma from your existence. You deserved unconditional love. I'm sorry I wasn't capable of being better." The final pages included photocopies of documents, additional medical records that further proved the conspiracy, financial records showing Robert's debts, and a notarized statement my mother had written taking full responsibility for everything and explicitly stating that I'd been innocent of all charges. She was giving me ammunition, I realized, in case I needed it for future legal proceedings, or simply for my own peace of mind. The letter ended simply, "I can't say I love you, because I don't know if I ever learned how to love properly. But I can say you deserved better. You deserved a real mother. I hope someday you find peace. Vivian." I sat at my kitchen table with tears streaming down my face, and Marcus didn't try to comfort me or tell me everything would be okay. He just sat there present and steady while I processed this final communication from the woman who'd given birth to me and then spent 3 decades punishing me for surviving. She couldn't say she loved me, and maybe she never had. But in her broken, twisted way, she'd finally told me I was never the problem. Sometimes that's the closest to love a damaged person can give. Understanding that my mother was broken didn't erase what she'd done, but it gave me something I hadn't expected: the ability to set down the weight of wondering if I'd somehow deserved it, and that freedom opened space for me to recognize the people who'd actually stood beside me when standing beside me meant risking everything. Marcus had his own closure to pursue, his own ghosts to lay to rest, and watching him finally vindicate his father became one of the most meaningful moments of the entire ordeal. Using evidence we'd uncovered during the Morgan investigation documents that showed my father's pattern of intellectual property theft going back decades, Marcus was finally able to prove what had happened to his father's sustainable housing project. He found the original architectural plans in a storage unit David Chen had rented before his death, every page timestamped and notarized, predating my father's supposedly original project by 8 months. The evidence was irrefutable, and Marcus compiled it all into a comprehensive investigative piece that took him 3 months to write, and was published by ProPublica under the title "The Morgan Method: 3 Decades of Stolen Ideas, Ruined Lives, and Corporate Fraud." The article was devastating in its thoroughness, documenting not just what had been done to David Chen, but to at least a dozen other architects, designers, and small business owners whose ideas my father had systematically stolen over 30 years. Marcus traced the pattern with the precision of someone who'd spent half his life preparing for this moment, and the journalism community recognized the work for what it was: a masterpiece of investigative reporting. The article won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Journalism, and I was there in the audience when Marcus accepted the award, watching this man who'd channeled 15 years of grief into pursuit of truth finally receive recognition for what he'd accomplished. But the award wasn't what mattered most to Marcus. What mattered was when the architectural community formally recognized David Chen's revolutionary sustainable housing design, acknowledging that the innovations my father had claimed as his own had actually been created by a brilliant architect who'd been destroyed for threatening the wrong powerful man. MIT established a scholarship in David Chen's name for students pursuing sustainable design, and Marcus told me with tears in his eyes that this was what his father had always wanted: not wealth or fame, but for his ideas to help create a better world. I went with Marcus when he visited his father's grave in a quiet cemetery in Queens. It was a clear autumn day, the kind where the light hits everything at an angle that makes the world look both beautiful and melancholy. Marcus placed the Pulitzer certificate against the headstone, and I heard him whisper, "I kept my promise, Dad. The world knows the truth now. Your name means something again." Over the 18 months of investigation, trial, and aftermath, Marcus and I had become inseparable in ways that defied easy categorization. We weren't lovers. We'd never crossed that line, never even discussed it directly. We were something else. Something deeper and more complicated. We were trauma-bonded war buddies who'd fought the same enemy and survived together. We were partners who understood each other's damage without needing constant explanation. He'd seen me at my absolute lowest and hadn't flinched. I'd witnessed his decades-long quest for justice and understood the weight he'd carried. When I decided to restart my design firm, I asked Marcus if he wanted to build something together. The old firm was too tainted, too connected to everything that had happened, but we could create something new that honored both our fathers' legacies. We called it Chen Morgan Design Collaborative, combining our names in a way that felt like reclaiming power from the people who'd tried to destroy us. Marcus brought his methodical research approach, his investigative skills, his ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. I brought my creative vision, my understanding of space and design, my eye for what made environments feel both beautiful and functional. Together, we were building something neither of us could have built alone. We worked side by side in a small office in Brooklyn, and sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was softer than friendship, more tentative than desire, something like wondering. And sometimes I'd find myself looking at him the same way, studying the line of his jaw when he was focused on spreadsheets, noticing how his eyes crinkled when he laughed, feeling a flutter in my chest that I wasn't quite ready to name. We both knew something was there, hovering in the space between us, but we'd both been burned by rushing into things, by confusing intensity with intimacy. One evening, as we were closing up the office reviewing designs for a new sustainable housing project we'd been commissioned to develop, Marcus paused and said quietly, "Maybe someday, when we're both whole again, when we've had time to heal properly and figure out who we are outside of survival mode." I understood exactly what he meant, and I felt grateful that he was brave enough to name what we were both thinking. "When we're whole," I agreed. "Not before. We've both learned what happens when you build a relationship on trauma instead of truth." The story could have ended with us falling into each other's arms with romantic love presented as the ultimate healing force that fixed everything broken. But that would have been a lie, and we'd both spent too long living with lies to accept them anymore. Marcus was my friend, my business partner, my ally in ways that mattered more than romance. He was someone who saw my full humanity when everyone else saw only scandal and shame. Whether we eventually became something more wasn't the point. The point was that I'd found an equal someone who fought beside me rather than for me, someone who understood that I didn't need rescuing but partnership. On the anniversary of the trial's end, we met at my apartment for dinner, and I realized I could finally drink champagne again without my hands shaking, without seeing my mother's face as she dropped poison into a glass. Marcus poured 2 glasses, and as we raised them, he said, "To surviving everything they tried to do to us." I clinked my glass against his and smiled. To surviving, yes, but more importantly, to winning. We drank, and the champagne tasted like celebration instead of betrayal, like possibility instead of poison. We were free in ways that went deeper than just legal vindication. We were free to choose who we wanted to be, who we wanted to trust, how we wanted to build our futures. Maybe someday that future would include romance. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, we'd built something that mattered. I didn't need someone to save me. I needed someone to fight beside me, someone who saw me as an equal worth fighting for. Everything else could wait for a day when my heart remembered how to trust. Learning to trust again would take time. I wasn't ready to rush, but learning to close doors that should have been closed decades ago, that was something I could do now, and I started with the hardest door of all. 9 months into his sentence, I visited my father in prison. It was a decision I made carefully, discussing it with my therapist for weeks before finally deciding I needed to see him one last time, not for him, but for myself, to prove I could stand in his presence without crumbling. The visiting room was nothing like the elegant spaces where we'd always interacted before. Cheap plastic chairs, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly, the smell of industrial cleaner barely masking decades of human desperation. My father had aged dramatically in those 9 months, as if prison had accelerated time itself. His hair had gone completely gray. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, and without his tailored suits and the boardrooms that had always framed him, he looked diminished in ways that were almost shocking. We sat across from each other with plexiglass between us, speaking through phones that crackled with static, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. He broke the silence first, his voice carrying an edge of bitterness that seemed to be all he had left. "You destroyed everything I built. 3 generations of Morgan legacy gone because you couldn't let things go." I looked at him through that scratched plexiglass and felt nothing except a kind of distant sadness for the man he might have been if he'd made different choices. "You destroyed yourself," I said quietly. "You made the decision to steal from people to manipulate your own family, to drug your daughter at her wedding. I just refuse to be buried in the rubble of your choices." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness and something that might have been grudging respect. "You're more like me than you want to admit, Celeste. Ruthless when you need to be, calculating, strategic. You played the game better than I taught you to, and that's why I'm in here and you're out there." I considered his words carefully because there was truth in them that I'd been avoiding. I had been ruthless in bringing him down. I had calculated every move, strategized with Marcus, and Agent Torres played roles and set traps. I had used every tool at my disposal to ensure his destruction was complete and public. "Maybe," I finally said, "maybe I am like you in some ways. But there's one critical difference between us. I used those traits to protect people and expose crimes. You used them to exploit people and commit crimes. That difference matters, Dad. That's the difference between justice and cruelty." I stood to leave, done with this conversation, done with him, ready to walk out of this prison and never return. His voice called after me as I moved toward the guard who would escort me out. "You'll never escape the Morgan name. It's who you are. It's in your blood, and no matter how far you run, people will always see you as Robert Morgan's daughter." I turned back to look at him one final time through that plexiglass barrier, and I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd ever given him because for the first time in my life, his threats couldn't touch me. "Watch me," I said simply. And then I walked away and didn't look back. The relationship I chose to rebuild was with Lily, though that process was slower and more complicated than either of us had anticipated. She'd moved to Portland and was working as an art therapist specializing in foster children, channeling her own childhood trauma into something that helped others heal. We video chatted weekly, these awkward but honest conversations, where we were both learning who the other person actually was beneath the roles our parents had assigned us. Lily had cut all contact with both Robert and Vivian, refusing to visit them or accept their phone calls, and I understood that she needed complete separation to find herself. During one of our calls about a year after the trial ended, Lily asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Do you hate me?" Her voice was small and frightened, and I could see the way she was bracing herself for my answer. I thought about it honestly before responding, because Lily deserved honesty more than she deserved false comfort. "I hated what you did. I hated that you participated in destroying me even though you were being blackmailed. But I understand why you did it now. We were both trapped in their system, both victims of their manipulation. You did what you thought you had to do to survive, and I can't hate you for being human and scared." She cried, relief visible even through the pixelated video connection. "I'm in therapy 3 times a week," she said through her tears. "I'm learning how to be a real person instead of just someone's replacement, someone's tool. It's harder than I thought it would be. I don't even know what I like or want sometimes because I spent so long just performing whatever role they needed." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "I'm in therapy too. We're both learning how to exist outside their narratives." We started planning a trip together, talking about maybe meeting somewhere neutral like Santa Fe or Charleston, places neither of us had family history. It would be a chance to build new memories, to be sisters on our own terms, instead of the roles we'd been forced to play. It wouldn't be perfect. We were both too damaged for perfect, too aware of how we'd hurt each other. But it would be real, and real was worth more than perfect had ever been. The person I didn't visit was Vivian, Her letter had been enough, giving me all the closure I needed or could expect from her. I understood the psychology now, the grief-driven cruelty, the way trauma gets passed down through generations like an inheritance of pain. Understanding didn't mean I had to reconcile with her. Some wounds heal better without being reopened, and seeing her again would have served no purpose except to give her access to me she no longer deserved. I wrote one letter back sitting at my kitchen table late one night when I couldn't sleep. "I forgive you for being broken," I wrote. "I don't forgive you for breaking me. The difference matters. I hope you find peace in whatever time you have left. I've found mine." I sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to the prison, and then I sat looking at it for a long time. Finally, I stood up, walked to my fireplace, and burned it. I watched the paper curl and blacken, watched my mother's name turn to ash, and felt something release in my chest that had been holding on too tight for too long. Forgiveness doesn't require the forgiven person's participation. It's not a gift you give to the person who hurt you. It's a gift you give yourself permission to stop carrying their weight. I gave myself that gift and let the ashes scatter. They'd spent my whole life teaching me I was incomplete without their approval, broken, without their validation, worthless, without their conditional love. Turns out, I was incomplete with it. Freedom meant walking away from the need to be seen by people who'd always chosen blindness. Walking away from the need to be seen by people who chose blindness was the beginning of learning to see myself clearly and exactly. 1 year after the trial concluded, I decided to mark that transformation with a ceremony that would reclaim the space where I'd almost been destroyed. The Morgan estate had been sold months earlier to a young tech CEO who knew nothing about its history, and when I contacted him about renting it for a day, he agreed without asking too many questions. I think he was charmed by the idea of hosting what I described as a celebration of survival. I was recreating my wedding, but this time I was doing it alone, and that aloneness was the entire point. 200 guests filled the grand hall on a crisp autumn afternoon. But these were different people than had attended the first time. These were real friends who'd stood by me during the worst months of my life, colleagues who'd quietly continued working with me even when my name was synonymous with scandal survivors of family trauma. I'd met through support groups who understood what it meant to rebuild yourself from ruins. Marcus was there with his mother, a kind woman who'd lost her husband to my father's cruelty and had somehow found it in her heart to welcome me as a friend. Agent Torres attended in a civilian dress instead of her usual professional suit, joking that this was the strangest case closure celebration she'd ever been invited to. The judge who'd presided over my parents' trial came telling me quietly that in 30 years on the bench he'd never seen someone fight back from such complete destruction with such grace and determination. Media was explicitly banned. This wasn't a spectacle, wasn't a publicity stunt or a viral moment waiting to happen. This was sacred, personal, a ritual of reclamation that belonged only to me and the people who genuinely cared whether I survived. I wore a simple ivory suit instead of a wedding gown, tailored and elegant but practical, the kind of thing you could actually move and actually live in. No veil covering my face, no train trailing behind me like the weight of expectations. Just myself, exactly as I was walking down the aisle alone with my head held high. The setup was unconventional, no bride's side, and groom's side, no traditional division of space. Instead, the chairs were arranged in circles around a central platform, everyone equal. Everyone witnessed, no hierarchy or assigned positions. When I reached the front where a celebrant I'd carefully chosen waited, I turned to face the people who'd gathered, and I saw their faces filled with curiosity and support, and something that looked like hope. I'd asked them all to come without really explaining what we were celebrating, and now it was time to show them. I spoke without notes, the words coming from somewhere deep and honest that I'd spent a year learning to access. A year ago, I was supposed to get married in this room. I wore a beautiful dress, said vows. I meant promised forever to a man I thought I loved. Instead, I almost died here, not physically, though they tried, but in every way that actually matters. My family tried to erase me, to rewrite my entire identity, to control every aspect of my future. They wanted to bury me alive in an institution while they spent my life's work to save themselves. They failed. I paused, looking around the room at faces that were listening with complete attention. Today I'm marrying the only person who's been with me through absolutely everything. The person who knows my worst moments and my best triumphs. The person who will never abandon me, never betray me, never demand that I shrink myself to make them more comfortable. Today, I'm marrying myself. I could feel the energy in the room shift, people leaning forward, understanding dawning on faces, and I continued with the vows I'd written over weeks of careful thought. I, Celeste Morgan, promise to protect you from people who demand you shrink to fit their expectations. I promise to honor your voice even when others try to silence you, especially when others try to silence you. I promise to love you unconditionally, not for what you achieve or how well you perform, but simply for who you are at your core. I promise to see you as whole and worthy exactly as you exist in this moment. I choose you, Celeste Morgan, today and always. The celebrant, a woman who specialized in non-traditional ceremonies, pronounced me committed to myself, and the room erupted in applause that felt like validation and celebration and recognition all at once. People were crying, including Marcus, who I saw wiping his eyes while his mother squeezed his shoulder. Agent Torres was grinning like she'd just closed another successful case. Lily appeared on a large screen via video call from Portland, and even through the pixels, I could see she was crying too. The reception that followed was joyful in ways my original wedding reception never could have been. There was dancing to music I actually liked. Laughter that wasn't performed for cameras. Conversations with people who knew me as a complete person rather than a trophy or a disappointment. The catering was from a small local restaurant I loved instead of some expensive place chosen for prestige. Everything was real, chosen by me, for me. Marcus gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry simultaneously, talking about resilience and the particular strength it takes to rebuild yourself when everything you thought you knew gets destroyed. Celeste taught me that survival isn't just about enduring, he said, raising his glass. It's about transforming what tried to kill you into something that makes you stronger. She's the bravest person I've ever known, and I'm honored to stand beside her. Lily's video toast from Portland talked about sisterhood redefined, about learning that family is something you choose rather than something you're trapped in. My sister taught me that you can love someone and still need distance from them while you heal, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She taught me that forgiveness is something you give yourself, not something you owe to people who hurt you. I'm still learning how to be a real person instead of someone's replacement, but she showed me it's possible. Agent Torres made everyone laugh by joking that this was definitely the most unusual case closure celebration in FBI history, but that it was also the most meaningful. Most of the time we close a case and move on, she said. But sometimes you work with someone who reminds you why you became an agent in the first place. Celeste reminded me that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about giving people back what was stolen from them. As evening fell and the party continued around me, I found myself standing at the exact spot where Lily had collapsed a year ago. The champagne stain that had marked that place was gone now, covered by new marble the estate's new owner had installed during renovations. I stood there holding a glass of champagne, real champagne, the expensive kind not poisoned or weaponized, but just a celebration in a glass, and I felt no fear, no trauma, no echo of that terrible day. Just peace and the satisfaction of having survived and transformed myself into someone my family could never have imagined. I raised the glass and spoke loud enough for the whole room to hear, and conversations quieted as people turned to listen. They tried to poison my life with their cruelty, their manipulation, their carefully constructed lies. But I drank it all, survived every drop, and transformed it into something they never expected: strength. This toast isn't to them. It's not about forgiveness or reconciliation or any of those things people say you're supposed to feel. This toast is to every person in this room who refused to let the poison win. To everyone who stood by me, who believed me, who helped me fight back. to survival, to truth, to the courage it takes to keep existing when people want you erased. People raised their glasses' voices, joining mine in a chorus of affirmation, and I felt surrounded by genuine love for the first time in my life. They wanted to destroy me, I said, speaking the final words that needed to be spoken, the ones I'd been building toward all night. Instead, they created someone who knows her own worth, someone who understands that she doesn't need anyone's approval to exist fully and completely. That was their biggest mistake, teaching me that I could survive without them, that I could thrive without them, that I was always enough all by myself. I drank the champagne tasting celebration instead of betrayal tasting freedom, instead of control tasting the future I'd chosen, rather than the one they'd tried to force on me. The room was full of people who saw me, truly saw me, and I finally understood what it meant to be witnessed rather than just observed. This time I raised the glass not to them, but to the woman they could never poison, control, or define. I raised it to myself. And that's how Celeste Morgan's story ends, not with a fairy tale rescue or a perfect happy ending, but with something far more powerful, a woman who rescued herself. She stood in the room where she was supposed to die, surrounded by people who chose to love her, and she married the one person who would never betray her, herself. This story isn't just about one woman's fight against a toxic family. It's about something all of us face at some point in our lives, the moment when we have to decide whether to keep seeking approval from people who will never give it, or to finally give that approval to ourselves. Celeste spent 35 years trying to earn love that was never going to be freely given. She achieved everything, built an empire, became successful beyond measure, and it was never enough for her parents, because the problem was never her. The problem was them. How many of us are still fighting that same battle? How many of us are still trying to prove ourselves to people who decided long ago that we weren't worth their unconditional love? Celeste's parents tried to bury her alive. Literally, tried to have her institutionalized and steal everything she'd built. And even that wasn't enough to break her. She found allies, she gathered evidence, she fought back with intelligence and strategy, and she won. Not because she was perfect, but because she refused to accept their narrative about who she was. The most radical thing Celeste did wasn't exposing her parents or winning in court. It was choosing herself. It was standing up in front of 200 people and saying, "I am enough exactly as I am." That's the real victory. That's the ending that matters. So here's my question for you. What would it look like if you married yourself? What would change in your life if you stopped waiting for someone else to validate your worth and just decided you were worthy all on your own? What toxic relationships are you still holding on to because you're afraid of being alone? Not realizing that being alone is better than being with people who poison you. If Celeste's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen by the people who were supposed to love you, if you've ever had to fight your way back from being destroyed by family, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me. What's the one thing you'd promise yourself if you were writing your own vows? What would you commit to protecting in yourself? And if you've already made that choice, if you've already walked away from toxic family and chosen yourself, tell us how you did it. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about people who refused to stay victims, who fought back, who survived and transformed their pain into power. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might change how you see yourself. And if this story affected you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes we all need permission to choose ourselves, and maybe Celeste's story can be that permission for someone you love. Remember, they wanted to destroy her. Instead, they taught her she was unbreakable. What are your battles teaching you? Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next story.